Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The smell of fresh-cut pine filled my nostrils as I wiped the sweat from my brow. It was a scorching August afternoon in 2018, and I was standing on the skeletal frame of what would soon be a luxury cabin, overlooking one of the pristine lakes that dotted the Coeur d'Alene National Forest. The view was breathtaking. Miles of dense evergreen forest stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the occasional glint of sunlight off distant water. I'm Tom Hawkins, a carpenter by trade. At 35, I'd been in the business for over a decade, but this job was something else. We were building a series of high-end vacation homes for some big-shot real estate developer from Seattle, the kind of place where Wall Street types could play mountain man for a week before jetting back to their penthouse apartments. "Hey, Tom, stop daydreaming and give me a hand with this beam." The gruff voice belonged to Mike, our foreman. A burly man in his 50s with arms like tree trunks and a perpetual scowl, Mike ran a tight ship. He didn't tolerate slacking, but he knew his stuff and always had our backs. I hurried over, grabbing the other end of the heavy wooden beam. As we maneuvered it into place, I couldn't help but marvel at how isolated we were out here. The nearest town, a little place called Wallace, was over an hour's drive away. Cell reception was spotty at best, and our only link to the outside world was a satellite phone in Mike's trailer for emergencies. "You hear about that hiker that went missing last week?" Mike grunted as we secured the beam. I shook my head. News traveled slow out here. Yeah, some college kid from Boise. Search and rescue have been combing the area for days. No trace. A chill ran down my spine despite the heat. It wasn't the first time I'd heard stories like this since we'd started the job 2 months ago. The forest had a way of swallowing people up. "Probably just got turned around," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "These woods can play tricks on you if you don't know what you're doing." Mike just grunted in response, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He'd been working these parts for decades and had a healthy respect for the wilderness. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across our work site, Mike called it a day. The crew, about a dozen of us in total, began packing up tools and securing the site. That's when I noticed Declan was missing. Declan O'Brien was an odd duck. In his late 20s, with wild red hair and a wilder imagination, he was always spinning yarns about the strange things he'd seen in these woods. Bigfoot sightings, UFOs, ghost lights, you name it, Declan had a story about it. Most of us wrote it off as bullshit, but there was something in the way he told those tales that always left me wondering. "Anyone seen Declan?" I called out. A chorus of shrugs and headshakes answered me. "Great. I'll go find him," I sighed, grabbing my flashlight, probably off chasing Sasquatch again. Mike nodded, tossing me the keys to his truck. "Take the F-150. And Tom, don't be long. These woods ain't friendly after dark." I caught the keys and headed for the old Ford, a knot forming in my stomach. I'd never admit it to the guys, but something about the forest at twilight set me on edge. The way the shadows seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. The strange sounds that echoed through the trees, too varied to all be from animals we could explain. As I started up the truck and pulled onto the rough logging trail that served as our access road, I tried to shake off the unease. It was just Declan being Declan, probably lost track of time while exploring some haunted grove or whatever his latest obsession was. But as the trees closed in around me and the last of the daylight faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the deepening shadows, something that didn't want us here. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. In the coming days, I'd learned that some of Declan's stories weren't as far-fetched as we'd all believed, and that sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones in campfire tales. They're the ones waiting just beyond the light, with teeth and claws all too real. The old Ford rattled and groaned as I navigated the rutted logging trail. Shadows deepened around me, the forest pressing in on all sides. I'd driven this road 100 times in daylight, but now, with darkness falling, it felt like venturing into another world entirely. My flashlight beam caught the reflective eyes of something in the underbrush. Probably just a deer, I told myself, ignoring the way my heart rate picked up. The rational part of my brain knew there was nothing to fear. Black bears and mountain lions were a possibility, sure, but attacks were rare. Still, some primal part of me couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, hunted. "Get it together, Tom," I muttered, shaking my head. Declan's crazy stories must be getting to me. Speaking of Declan, where the hell was he? I'd been driving for about 15 minutes with no sign of him. Just as I was about to turn back, convinced he must have returned to camp by another route, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. There, illuminated in my headlights, was Declan's battered hard hat lying in the middle of the road. I pulled over, the truck's engine ticking as it cooled. The silence that fell when I cut the ignition was absolute. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of wind through the trees. Just dead silence. "Declan?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the stillness. "Declan, you out here?" No response. With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The beam of light danced across the undergrowth as I approached the hard hat. No signs of a struggle, no blood. That was good, right? I picked up the hat, turning it over in my hands. That's when I noticed the claw marks. 3 deep gouges ran along the brim as if something with massive, sharp claws had swiped at it. "Jesus," I whispered, nearly dropping the hat in shock. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness to my left. I whirled, heart pounding, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Nothing, just endless trees and shadows. "Did Declan?" I tried again, hating the tremor in my voice. "This isn't funny, man. Come on out." Another snap, closer this time, and then carried on a sudden gust of wind, a smell hit me. Like rotting meat and wet dog, so strong it made my eyes water. I gagged, stumbling back towards the truck. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, illuminated in the flashlight's beam, a pair of eyes reflecting back at me from the darkness. Not the dull reflection of a deer or a raccoon. These eyes gleamed with an unsettling intelligence, and they were huge, set too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. I didn't think, I ran. Scrambling into the truck, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I slammed it into drive, tires spinning in the loose gravel as I accelerated. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something, a massive dark shape moving with impossible speed through the underbrush. I pushed the old truck to its limits, branches whipping against the windows as I tore down the narrow road. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before I burst out of the tree line and into the clearing where our camp was set up. I screeched to a halt, the truck's headlights illuminating a cluster of confused faces. "Tom? What the hell?" Mike approached, concern etched on his weathered features. "Where's Declan?" I stumbled out of the truck, Declan's damaged hard hat clutched in my white-knuckled grip. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, the claw marks, the eyes in the darkness, the overwhelming stench. With each detail, I could see the disbelief on their faces turning to concern. All right, calm down," Mike said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his worry. "We'll get a search party together. Whatever's out there, we'll find Declan." As the crew mobilized, gathering flashlights and walkie-talkies, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes in the darkness. Deep down, I knew we were no longer the hunters in these woods. We were the prey. And whatever was out there, it was just getting started. The search party moved through the darkened forest like a procession of fireflies, our flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. The initial adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a gnawing dread that grew with each passing minute. We'd been at it for hours, combing the area where I'd found Declan's hard hat, but there was no sign of our missing friend. Mike led the group, his face a mask of grim determination. He'd insisted on coming himself, leaving a couple of guys back at camp to man the satellite phone in case Declan showed up there. The rest of us, about 8 in total, spread out in a loose line, calling Declan's name at regular intervals. The forest felt different at night. Sounds carried strangely, echoing off unseen slopes and rocky outcroppings. More than once I whirled around, certain I'd heard footsteps behind me, only to find nothing there. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, playing tricks on my already frayed nerves. "Over here!" A shout from Jeff, one of the younger guys on the crew, snapped me out of my paranoid reverie. We all converged on his position, flashlights illuminating a small clearing. What I saw there haunts me to this day. It was Declan's jacket, or what was left of it. The sturdy work coat had been shredded, strips of fabric hanging from low branches like some kind of macabre flag. But it was the blood that turned my stomach. Dark stains matted the remaining fabric, still tacky to the touch. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. I wasn't sure who. Maybe it was me. Mike crouched down, examining the scene with a flashlight. His face was ashen, but his voice remained steady. "Spread out. Look for any sign of him." We did as we were told, though a part of me wanted nothing more than to run back to the relative safety of our camp. As I swept my flashlight across the underbrush, something caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I moved closer, my breath caught in my throat. Footprints. But not human footprints. These were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, and the shape was all wrong, elongated, with what looked like claw marks gouging the soft earth at the end of each print. "Mike," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." The foreman made his way over, followed by a couple of the others. We all stared at the tracks in stunned silence. "What the hell made those?" Jeff asked, his earlier bravado replaced by naked fear. Mike shook his head slowly. "I don't know. In all my years in these woods, I've never seen anything like this." A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our little circle of light. We all tensed, flashlights swinging wildly to pinpoint the source of the noise. For a moment I could have sworn I saw those eyes again, yellow, intelligent, filled with a hunger that sent ice through my veins. "We need to get out of here," I said, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. "Now." No one argued. We made our way back to camp in record time, jumping at every shadow and snapping twig. The thing that had taken Declan, because by now we were all certain something had taken him, it was out there, watching us, hunting us. Back at camp, we huddled in Mike's trailer, the satellite phone our lifeline to the outside world. As Mike called in the authorities, explaining the situation as best he could, I found myself staring out the small window into the impenetrable darkness beyond. What had we stumbled into out here? What kind of creature could do what had been done to Declan? And more importantly, was it coming for the rest of us next? As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I made a silent vow. Whatever this thing was, however long it took, I was going to find out the truth. For Declan, for all of us. Because one thing was certain, our lives would never be the same after this night in the Idaho wilderness. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews, search and rescue operations, and sleepless nights. The authorities arrived in force, local sheriff's deputies, state police, even a couple of FBI agents. They combed the woods with dogs and high-tech equipment, but found no trace of Declan beyond what we'd already discovered. Our worksite became a hub of activity, with helicopters buzzing overhead and grim-faced men in uniforms tramping through the underbrush. The official story, as told to us by a square-jawed state trooper named Erickson, was that Declan had likely been the victim of a bear attack. "Black bears aren't usually aggressive," Erickson explained, his tone carefully neutral. "But if he surprised one or got between a mother and her cubs..." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. I wanted to argue, to tell him about the massive footprints, the intelligence I'd seen in those yellow eyes. But one look at Mike's warning glare kept me quiet. We'd all agreed to keep the weirder details to ourselves, at least until we could make sense of what had happened. As the days wore on and the search turned up nothing, an uneasy tension settled over our camp. Work on the cabins had been suspended indefinitely, but none of us felt right about leaving. It was as if we were all waiting for something, though none of us could say exactly what. It was on the fourth night after Declan's disappearance that things took another turn for the strange. I was having trouble sleeping as usual when a commotion outside my trailer caught my attention. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped out into the cool night air. A small crowd had gathered near the edge of our camp. As I approached, I saw what had drawn their attention. There, just beyond the ring of light cast by our flood lamps, was something. At first glance, it looked like a deer carcass, but as I drew closer, my stomach churned. The animal had been torn apart, its innards strewn across the forest floor in a grotesque display. but it was the arrangement that sent a chill down my spine. The viscera had been laid out in a deliberate pattern, almost like some kind of twisted symbol. "What the hell?" I whispered, fighting the urge to vomit. Mike pushed through the crowd, his face grim. "Everyone back to your trailers, now." "But shouldn't we call the cops?" someone asked. Mike shook his head. "In the morning. For now, everyone inside. And for God's sake, stay alert." As we dispersed, I caught Mike's eye. There was something there, a mix of fear and recognition. He jerked his head towards his trailer, a clear invitation to talk privately. Once inside, Mike poured us each a generous finger of whiskey. We drank in silence for a moment before he spoke. "I've seen this before," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on something distant. "About 15 years ago, up near the Canadian border. Same kind of thing, mangled animals, weird symbols, people going missing." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "What was it?" Mike took another swig of whiskey. "Never found out for sure. The official story was a cult, some whack jobs playing games in the woods. But I saw things, Tom. Things that don't fit any explanation I can think of." He fell silent again, lost in memory. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something out there in these woods. Something old and hungry and smart." Mike's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I took another swig of whiskey, welcoming the burn in my throat. It helped ground me in reality as my mind reeled from what Mike was suggesting. "So what do we do?" I asked, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. Mike rubbed his face, suddenly looking every one of his 50-plus years. "We keep our eyes open, we watch each other's backs, and we get the hell out of here as soon as we can do it without raising suspicions." I nodded, but a nagging thought wouldn't leave me. "What about Declan? We can't just leave him out there." "Declan's gone, Tom," Mike said, his voice gentle but firm. "Whatever's out there, I don't think there's anything left of him to find." The finality in his tone sent a chill through me. As I left Mike's trailer and made my way back to my own, the forest seemed to press in around me, alive with hidden menace. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next few days passed in a haze of tension and fear. The police investigation wound down, with no new leads and no sign of Declan. We went through the motions of work, more to keep ourselves occupied than out of any real progress on the cabins. It was on the third night after our discovery of the mutilated deer that everything came to a head. I was jolted awake by a scream, raw, primal, and terrifyingly close. Grabbing my flashlight, I burst out of my trailer. The camp was in chaos. People were running, shouting, flashlight beams cutting wild arcs through the darkness. And there, at the edge of our floodlight's reach, I saw it. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a twisted amalgamation of bear and wolf. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. Yellow, intelligent, and filled with an ancient, implacable hunger. The same eyes I'd seen in the woods the night Declan disappeared. It moved with impossible speed for something so large, snatching Jeff, the young worker who'd found Declan's jacket, before any of us could react. Jeff's scream cut off abruptly as the creature dragged him into the darkness. "Get to the trucks," Mike's voice cut through the panic. "Move now." We ran, stumbling through the dark towards where we'd parked our vehicles. I could hear it behind us, branches snapping, that musky, rotten smell growing stronger. I reached Mike's F-150 first, yanking the door open and scrambling inside. Others piled in after me. I didn't stop to see who. Mike gunned the engine, tires spinning in the loose gravel as we tore out of the campsite. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the creature emerging from the tree line. Even at this distance, I could see the blood dripping from its muzzle. Then we were around a bend, the view lost to the darkness. We drove in tense silence, everyone jumping at shadows. It wasn't until we hit the main highway, the lights of Wallace visible in the distance, that anyone spoke. What was that thing?" someone in the back seat whispered. Mike's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." But I knew we couldn't leave it at that. Whatever this creature was, it was still out there, still hunting. We gave our statements to the police, sticking to a sanitized version of events that left out the more unbelievable details. Search and rescue went back in but found no trace of Jeff or the creature. Eventually the case went cold. filed away as yet another mysterious disappearance in the vast Idaho wilderness. But I couldn't let it go. Over the next year, I dug into local legends, pored over old newspaper articles, and reached out to anyone who might have encountered something similar. Slowly, a pattern emerged, stretching back decades, maybe even centuries. Sightings of a creature that defied explanation, disappearances that were never solved. It was a year to the day after our encounter that I found myself driving back up that logging road, alone this time. I knew it was foolish, probably suicidal, but I needed answers. The work site was overgrown now, nature reclaiming what we'd carved out of the forest. As night fell, I set up camp in the shell of one of the unfinished cabins, a shotgun close at hand. Hours passed. The forest was alive with normal nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I was beginning to think I'd made this trip for nothing when the noises suddenly stopped. That silence, so familiar and yet still terrifying, settled over the woods. And then I heard it. Heavy footsteps drawing closer. I raised the shotgun, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it could hear me. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, those yellow eyes gleaming in the moonlight. For a long moment we just stared at each other. I knew I should run, should shoot, should do something, but I was transfixed. Then to my utter shock it spoke. The voice was like gravel and thunder, barely recognizable as words, but unmistakably intelligent. "You came back," it rumbled. "Brave, foolish." Questions tumbled from me. What was it? Why was it here? What did it want? But as the night wore on and we talked, I realized the answers were both simpler and more complex than I could have imagined. It was old, so old it had forgotten its own origins. It had been here long before humans came to these lands and would likely be here long after we were gone. It hunted, yes, but not out of malice, just as a wolf doesn't hate the deer it chases. As dawn broke, the creature melted back into the forest. I was left with more questions than answers, but also a profound sense of the world's mysteries, of the things that lurk just beyond the edge of firelight, in the deep woods and wild places. I never saw the creature again, though sometimes on dark nights when the wind whispers through the pines, I think I catch a glimpse of yellow eyes watching from the shadows. A reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that remind us that we are not and have never been at the top of the food chain. To this day, I'm not sure if anyone will believe my story. Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I know that out there in the vast wilderness of Idaho, there are secrets waiting to be discovered, mysteries that defy explanation. And sometimes, on nights when the veil between worlds seems thin, I find myself looking to the mountains, wondering if it's still out there, watching, waiting, reminding us that there are some things humans were never meant to fully understand. Years have passed since that night in the Idaho wilderness. I've moved on, or at least I've tried to. Got married, had kids, settled into a comfortable life in the suburbs. But I've never forgotten. Sometimes I'll catch a news story about another mysterious disappearance in those mountains, about strange sightings or unexplained phenomena, and I'll wonder, I've never told anyone the full story of what happened out there. Who would believe me? But I keep watch. I stay prepared, because I know the truth that most people never learn. The monsters are real. They're out there in the dark spaces of the world. And sometimes, if we're not careful, they find their way into the light. So if you ever find yourself in those Idaho woods and the night grows quiet and you feel eyes upon you, run, and don't look back, because not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and some hungers can never truly be satisfied. The early morning mist clung to the ancient pines as I made my way through the dense undergrowth of Oregon's Willamette National Forest. The year was 2019, and I'd been working as a surveyor for the better part of a decade. There was something about the solitude of the backcountry that always called to me, far more appealing than the sterile confines of an office cubicle. My name is Michael, and this is the story of an encounter that shook my understanding of the natural world to its core. The project seemed routine enough at first. My partner Kai and I had been tasked with charting a route for a new logging road deep in the heart of the forest. It was challenging work, but nothing we hadn't handled before. Days stretched into weeks as we hacked our way through the wilderness, taking measurements and leaving a trail of bright orange markers in our wake. Kai was a good partner, experienced, level-headed, and with a dry sense of humor that helped pass the long hours. We had worked together on several projects before, and I trusted him implicitly. You need that kind of trust when you're miles from civilization, surrounded by the kind of terrain that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. "Hey, Michael," Kai called out one morning as we were loading up the truck. "You see the news about those missing hikers?" I paused, a thermos of coffee halfway to my lips. "No, what happened?" Kai's face was grim as he passed me his phone. The local news site showed pictures of two smiling young women, both in their early 20s. The headline read, "Search continues for missing hikers in Willamette National Forest." "Third disappearance this year," Kai muttered. "Rangers are saying it might be a cougar, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the early morning air. I'd encountered my fair share of cougars over the years, and while they were certainly dangerous, it was rare for them to attack humans unprovoked. 3 disappearances in 1 year? That didn't sit right. "We'll keep our eyes open," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Stick together, make noise, the usual precautions." Kai nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We both knew the forest held its secrets, and not all of them were benign. As we drove deeper into the wilderness, the looming trees seemed to close in around us. The road narrowed to little more than a dirt track, our truck jostling over exposed roots and hidden rocks. The radio faded to static, and soon the only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the occasional call of a distant bird. We parked at our usual spot, a small clearing that barely qualified as a campsite. From here we'd hike to the edge of our survey area, picking up where we'd left off the day before. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as we gathered our equipment. "Ready to blaze some trails?" I asked, shouldering my pack. Kai grinned, patting the holster at his hip. "Always, though I'm hoping this little friend stays hidden today." I nodded, eyeing the pistol. It was standard procedure to carry protection against predators, but in all our years working these forests, we'd never had to use it. I hoped today wouldn't be the day that changed. As we set off into the undergrowth, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The forest seemed different somehow, the shadows deeper, the silence more pronounced. I told myself it was just the news of the missing hikers playing on my mind, but a part of me wondered if there was something more to it. Little did I know, that day would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. Hours passed as Kai and I worked our way through the dense forest. The familiar routine of taking measurements, jotting down coordinates, and marking our path helped ease some of the tension I'd felt earlier. By midday we had made good progress, pushing further into uncharted territory than we had on previous days. "We should be able to wrap this section up before lunch," I called out to Kai, who was a few yards ahead, clearing a path through some particularly stubborn underbrush. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy hand. "Sounds good to me, I'm starving." We pressed on, the forest growing denser as we approached the edge of our survey area. The canopy overhead was so thick that it felt like twilight, despite the fact that it was barely past noon. The air grew still, the usual chorus of birdsong and insect buzzing fading to an eerie silence. I was about to comment on the strange quiet when I noticed Kai had stopped dead in his tracks. His body was rigid, one hand raised in a warning gesture. I froze, my usual wise-ass remark dying on my lips. Something felt wrong, terribly, inexplicably wrong. Kai's eyes were fixed on a thicket of brush across a small ravine to our right. I followed his gaze, straining to see what had caught his attention. At first I saw nothing but shadows and tangled vegetation, then a flicker of movement. My breath caught in my throat as I glimpsed something massive shifting within the trees. For a split second my brain tried to rationalize it as a deer, but I knew instantly that was wrong. The shape was all wrong, too tall, too unnatural. "Cougar," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Even as the word left my mouth, I knew it wasn't right. Kai's brow furrowed, his eyes darting back and forth as he scanned the tree line. "Maybe," he murmured, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe it any more than I did. "Let's back up slow. Get to the truck." We began to inch backward, every rustle of leaves beneath our feet sounding like a thunderclap in the unnatural silence. I risked a glance over my shoulder and felt my blood run cold. The thing, whatever it was, had moved closer. I could make out a gaunt silhouette slipping between the pines, far too large to be any animal I was familiar with. Then the smell hit me. A putrid, overwhelming stench of rotting meat that made my stomach lurch. This was no cougar, no bear, nothing I had ever encountered in all my years in the wilderness. Panic surged through me, overriding any semblance of rational thought. Kai and I broke into a stumbling run, no longer caring about stealth. I swore loudly as my foot caught on an exposed root, nearly sending me sprawling. "We're almost there," Kai panted as we neared the tree line where we'd left our truck. "Just a little further." His words cut off abruptly as the creature stepped into the open. Time seemed to stand still as I took in the impossible sight before us. The thing stood on its hind legs, easily 7 feet tall, its body lean and emaciated like a starved wolf. But no wolf I'd ever seen looked like this. Its fur was patchy and ragged, hanging in clumps from its grotesquely elongated limbs. The snout was too long, filled with yellowed, needle-sharp teeth. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed with an unnatural yellow light, filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, we all just stood there, Kai and I, chests heaving as we tried to catch our breath, and the creature watching us with those terrible eyes. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator, unable to move, unable to think. The spell was broken by Kai's strangled whisper. "Gun." He scrambled to unholster the pistol at his hip, fingers fumbling with the catch. The creature's posture changed in an instant, dropping down onto all fours with a speed that defied belief. A guttural snarl ripped through the air, unlike anything I'd ever heard before, part wolf, part something far more ancient and terrifying. "Run!" Kai yelled, finally freeing his weapon. We needed no further encouragement. Blind panic flooded my system, drowning out everything but the primal need to escape. Kai's pistol roared as we raced towards the relative safety of our truck, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. The bullets must have found their mark because a howl split the air, a sound of such fury and pain that it chilled me to my very core. But I barely registered it, my entire being focused on reaching the truck and the promise of safety it represented. We burst into the clearing where we'd parked, a tiny oasis of sunlight in the oppressive gloom of the forest. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us, getting closer with each passing second. Kai reached the truck first, yanking open the driver's side door and hurling himself inside. I was mere steps behind him when the beast exploded from the tree line. Time seemed to slow as I turned my head, catching a glimpse of matted fur, yellow eyes, and gleaming teeth. The thing was moving so fast it was little more than a blur, but in that moment, I saw it with horrifying clarity. I threw myself into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut just as the creature slammed into the side of the truck. The impact rocked the vehicle, and I heard the sickening sound of rending metal. Kai was already turning the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. A furious snarl filled the air as the beast hurled itself at the driver's side window. The glass shattered, showering Kai with glittering shards. I screamed, recoiling as I caught a glimpse of a hellish maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. Kai threw the truck into gear, his face a mask of terror and determination. The tires spun in the loose dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust as we fishtailed out of the clearing. The beast's howls pursued us, growing fainter as we tore down the rough logging road, branches whipping against the sides of the truck. We didn't stop until we reached the main highway, our hearts pounding in our chests. For a long moment, all Kai and I could do was shake our heads and swear under our breath, the reality of what we'd just experienced too overwhelming to process. Finally, Kai pulled out his phone with trembling hands. I need to call this in," he muttered. I nodded numbly, still struggling to come to terms with what I'd seen. As Kai spoke to the ranger station, describing what he called a mangy dog attack, I noticed he left out the truly bizarre aspects of our encounter. I couldn't blame him. Who would believe us? The next few days passed in a blur. Animal control set some traps in the area but caught nothing. The search for the missing hikers continued, but no trace of them was ever found. Kai and I gave our official statements, sticking to a sanitized version of events that wouldn't raise too many eyebrows. A week after the incident, we returned to the site, armed with bigger guns and a healthy dose of fear. The forest was eerily silent, devoid of the usual sounds of wildlife. All we found were the shattered remains of the truck window and long, deep gouges carved into the metal siding, a chilling reminder that what we'd experienced had been all too real. In the years since that day, I've pored over countless reports of similar encounters, read every dogman tale I could find online. I used to think they were exaggerated, some combination of bear sightings and overactive imaginations fueled by campfire stories. Now I'm not so sure. I've spent my entire adult life in the woods, and I've never seen anything like what Kai and I encountered that day. We got lucky, plain and simple. Whatever that thing was, it could have easily killed us both. I'm still out there with my map and compass, still doing the job I love. But now I keep a closer eye on the shadows. And maybe, just maybe, I'm considering investing in something a bit stronger than a pistol for my next trip into the backcountry. Because out there in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, there are things that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist, but do. And once you've seen them, you can never truly feel safe in the forest again. The drive back to civilization that day was a blur. Neither Kai nor I spoke much, both of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd just experienced. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving us shaky and exhausted. Every shadow on the road seemed to hide some new horror, and more than once I caught myself flinching at perfectly ordinary sounds. We pulled into the ranger station just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Ranger Johnson, a grizzled veteran of the Forest Service, was waiting for us. His weathered face creased with concern as he took in our disheveled appearance and the damage to the truck. "Boys," he said, his voice grave, "what in the hell happened out there?" Kai and I exchanged a look. How could we possibly explain what we'd seen? Who would believe us? "Dog attack," Kai said finally, his voice hoarse. "Big one came out of nowhere." Johnson's eyebrows shot up. "A dog? Out there?" I nodded, backing up Kai's story. "Yeah, must have been feral, biggest damn dog I've ever seen." The ranger's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I was sure he was going to call us out on our obvious lie. But then he just sighed, shaking his head. "All right, let's get you two inside. You look like you could use a strong cup of coffee." As we followed Johnson into the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. The way his eyes had lingered on the claw marks scoring the side of the truck, the slight hesitation before he accepted our story. It all felt off somehow. Inside, we gave our official statements, sticking to the sanitized version of events we'd agreed upon. A large, aggressive animal, possibly a feral dog. No, we didn't get a clear look at it. Yes, we fired warning shots. No, we didn't think we'd hit it. Throughout the questioning, I could feel Johnson's eyes on us, studying our faces as if trying to read between the lines of our story. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You boys are lucky," he said finally. "We've had incidents in that area before. Nothing quite like this, but—" He trailed off, his gaze distant. "What kind of incidents?" I asked, my curiosity overriding my exhaustion. Johnson seemed to snap back to the present. "Oh, you know, the usual. Hikers going off trail, getting lost, animal attacks, nothing to worry about." But there was something in his tone that set off alarm bells in my head. I glanced at Kai and saw my own unease reflected in his eyes. "Anyway," Johnson continued, standing up, "we'll send a team out to investigate in the morning. For now, you two should head home, get some rest. You've had quite a day." As we left the station, the sun had fully set, plunging the world into darkness. The forests that surrounded us suddenly seemed more threatening, the shadows deeper and more foreboding. I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. "You think he bought it?" Kai asked as we walked to our cars. I shrugged. "I don't know. But did you get the feeling he wasn't telling us everything?" Kai nodded slowly. "Yeah, like he's seen something like this before." We stood there for a moment, the weight of the day's events pressing down on us. Finally, Kai spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since we'd escaped that thing. What do you do when you've seen something that shouldn't exist, when the world as you know it has been turned upside down? "We keep quiet," I said finally. "At least for now. No one would believe us anyway." Kai nodded, relief evident on his face. Yeah, you're right. We just go back to our lives, pretend it never happened." But even as I agreed, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. You can't unsee something like that. You can't just forget and move on. The memory of those glowing eyes, that unnatural howl, would haunt me for years to come. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and anxious days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature. Its impossible form burned into my retinas. The sound of its howl echoed in my dreams, jolting me awake in a cold sweat. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects, anything to keep my mind occupied. But even as I pored over maps and charts, a part of me was always alert, always watching the shadows. The forest that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a threat, hiding untold horrors behind every tree. Kai wasn't faring much better. We met for beers about a week after the incident, both of us looking haggard and sleep-deprived. "You been sleeping?" he asked, though the dark circles under his eyes told me he already knew the answer. I shook my head, taking a long pull from my beer. "Not really, you?" "Same," he sighed. "Keep seeing that thing every time I close my eyes." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared secret hanging between us. "I've been doing some research," I said finally. "Looking into similar sightings, unexplained disappearances in the area." Kai's eyes widened. And there's more out there than I thought. A lot more." I pulled out my phone, showing him a website I'd found. "Look at this, dozens of reports all over the Pacific Northwest, people seeing things that match what we saw, hikers going missing without a trace." Kai scrolled through the site, his face growing paler with each passing moment. "Jesus," he muttered, "how have we never heard about this before?" I shrugged. Most people write it off as folklore, urban legends, but after what we saw— "You think it's all connected?" Kai asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we need to find out." Over the next few months, Kai and I dove deep into the world of cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. We pored over old newspaper articles, combed through online forums, and even reached out to a few self-proclaimed Bigfoot hunters in the area. Most of what we found was clearly nonsense, blurry photos that could have been anything, second-hand accounts that changed with each retelling. But there were a few reports that stood out, cases that bore an eerie similarity to our own encounter. One in particular caught my attention. In 1978, a logger named Frank Dobson reported seeing a wolf-like creature standing on two legs in the Willamette National Forest. His description matched what we had seen almost perfectly: the height, the elongated limbs, even the yellow eyes. "We need to talk to this guy," I told Kai one evening as we sat surrounded by stacks of printouts and old books. Kai frowned. "Michael, that was over 40 years ago. What makes you think he's even still alive?" I grinned, holding up a piece of paper. "Because I found him. Frank Dobson, 85 years old, living in a retirement community just outside of Eugene." 2 days later, we were sitting in Frank Dobson's small apartment, surrounded by fishing trophies and faded photographs. Frank was a small man, wizened with age, but his eyes were sharp and alert as he studied us. "So," he said, his voice gravelly with age, "you boys want to know about the Wolfman, huh?" We nodded, and Frank leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "It was 78, like I told the papers back then. I was out marking trees for cutting, way out in the deep woods, place where most folks never go." He paused, taking a sip of water. "That's when I saw it, standing there, bold as brass, staring right at me." Frank's description matched our experience almost exactly: the height, the lean body, the yellow eyes. But there was more. "It wasn't alone," Frank continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "There were others moving in the shadows. I could hear 'em, see their eyes glowing in the dark." A chill ran down my spine. "Others? How many?" Frank shrugged. Couldn't say for sure. 3, maybe 4, but they were there watching, waiting. As we left Frank's apartment, my mind was reeling. It wasn't just one creature we were dealing with. There was a whole pack of them out there. What do we do now? Kai asked as we drove back to town. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. We go back, I said. We find proof. It took weeks of planning and preparation. We gathered equipment, better cameras, night vision goggles, even a few trail cams we planned to set up in the area where we'd had our encounter. We also invested in some serious firepower, just in case. The day we set out, the sky was overcast, a light drizzle falling as we made our way deep into the Willamette National Forest. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, but now it carried an undercurrent of menace. We set up camp in a small clearing, close to where we'd had our original encounter, but not too close. As night fell, the forest came alive with sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But underneath it all was a silence, a stillness that set my nerves on edge. "You feel that?" Kai whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond our campfire. I nodded. "Like we're being watched." We took turns keeping watch through the night, but nothing unusual happened. As dawn broke, we set out to place our trail cams, moving quietly through the misty forest. It was on the third day that things changed. We were reviewing footage from one of the trail cams when we heard it, a long, low howl that echoed through the trees. It was distant but unmistakable. Kai and I looked at each other, our faces pale in the fading light. "That's it," I whispered. "That's the sound." We grabbed our gear and headed in the direction of the howl, moving as quietly as we could through the dense undergrowth. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening as the sun sank lower in the sky. Then we saw it. A flash of movement in the trees ahead, too big to be a deer or a bear. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. Slowly, carefully, I raised my camera, zooming in on the spot where we'd seen the movement. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a pair of yellow eyes appeared in the viewfinder, glowing in the gathering darkness. "Michael," Kai's voice was tense, urgent. "We need to go, now." I lowered the camera, ready to agree when I saw why Kai sounded so afraid. All around us in the deepening shadows of the forest, pairs of yellow eyes were appearing. We were surrounded. What happened next was a blur of terror and adrenaline. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit close behind us. Howls filled the air, closer now, hungry and triumphant. We burst into a small clearing, gasping for breath. The truck was close, just beyond the next line of trees. We might make it. That's when the largest of the creatures stepped into our path. It was even bigger than the one we'd seen before, its matted fur silvery in the moonlight, its yellow eyes fixed on us with terrifying intelligence. Time seemed to stand still as we faced the creature. In that moment I understood that we were facing something ancient, something that had existed in these woods long before humans ever set foot here. This was its territory, and we were the intruders. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and I braced myself for the end. But then, inexplicably, it turned away. With a last long look at us, it melted back into the forest. The other creatures followed, their eyes disappearing one by one into the darkness. Kai and I stood there shaking for what felt like hours. When we finally made it back to the truck, we found long, deep scratches scored into the metal, a warning or perhaps a message. We never went back to that part of the forest again. The footage we captured that night was blurry, inconclusive. We could have taken it to the media, tried to prove what we'd seen, but something held us back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was a newfound respect for the mysteries of the wilderness. Years have passed since that night, but I still dream of yellow eyes watching me from the shadows. The forest holds many secrets, and some of them, I've learned, are better left undiscovered. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes wonder about those creatures. Are they still out there, moving silently through the ancient woods? And if they are, how long have they been there? How long will they remain, hidden from the world of men, guarding their secrets in the deep, dark heart of the forest? The piercing shriek of the alarm jolted me awake, my heart instantly racing. I fumbled for my glasses on the nightstand, nearly knocking them to the floor in my haste. As I shoved them onto my face, the world came into focus. The Spartan walls of the bunkhouse, the silhouettes of my fellow smoke jumpers already in motion, pulling on gear with practiced efficiency. "Move it, rookie," Ezra shouted, his gruff voice cutting through the chaos. Despite having been on the team for nearly 2 seasons, I was still the rookie to most of the veterans. I didn't mind. It pushed me to work harder, to prove myself worthy of standing shoulder to shoulder with these men and women who routinely threw themselves into danger. I leapt from my bunk, adrenaline flooding my system as I grabbed my jumpsuit. The fabric was rough against my skin as I zipped it up, my fingers flying over the various clasps and buckles. My mind raced through the possibilities. Where were we headed? How bad was the fire? The uncertainty was always the hardest part, those moments before we knew what we were up against. "Bitterroot National Forest," Captain Reeves's voice boomed through the bunkhouse. "Looks like a bad one, folks. Let's move." A collective groan rippled through the team. The Bitterroot was notorious for its unpredictable weather patterns and rugged terrain. It was beautiful country, no doubt, but fighting fires there was like trying to wrestle a tornado. You never knew which way it was going to turn next. As we piled into the waiting vans, I found myself next to Ezra. His weathered face was set in grim determination, the lines around his eyes more pronounced than usual. "You ready for this, kid?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "Born ready," I replied, earning a snort of amusement from the older man. "We'll see about that," Ezra muttered, but there was no malice in his tone. If anything, I detected a hint of approval. The ride to the airfield was tense, filled with the usual pre-jump banter gallows humor that helped keep the fear at bay. I joined in half-heartedly, my mind already on the task ahead. As we suited up and boarded the plane, I couldn't shake the feeling that this jump was going to be different. Something in the air, a heaviness that settled in my gut, warned me that we were heading into more than just another forest fire. If only I had known then how right that feeling would turn out to be. The roar of the plane's engines filled my ears as we soared over the Montana wilderness. Through the small window, I could see plumes of smoke rising in the distance, angry black clouds that blotted out the sun. The Bitterroot National Forest stretched out below us, a vast sea of green now threatened by the advancing inferno. Captain Reeves stood at the front of the cargo hold, his voice barely audible over the din. "Listen up. We've got a Class G fire on our hands. That means it's big, it's nasty, and it's not playing by the rules. Our job is to get in there and establish a fire line before this thing jumps the ridge and threatens the town of Hamilton." He paused, his eyes scanning our faces. "I don't need to tell you how dangerous this is. We're jumping into unknown territory with limited intel. Stay alert, stay together, and for God's sake, stay alive. Any questions?" The silence that followed was answer enough. We'd all been here before, knew the risks. This was what we signed up for, what we trained for. Still, I couldn't help the flutter of nerves in my stomach as I double-checked my parachute straps. Ezra caught my eye, giving me a reassuring nod. "You've got this, rookie," he mouthed, the ghost of a smile on his lips. The jump light flashed green, and suddenly we were in motion. One by one, my teammates disappeared out the open door, swallowed up by the smoky air. Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath, steeled my nerves, and leapt into the void. For a moment there was nothing but the rush of wind and the thundering of my own heart. Then my chute deployed, jerking me upward with enough force to knock the breath from my lungs. As I drifted down towards the burning forest, I could feel the heat rising to meet me, see the dance of flames through the trees. The landing was rough, the forest floor uneven and treacherous. I hit the ground running, quickly disconnecting my chute and gathering my gear. Around me I could hear the shouts of my teammates as we regrouped, the crackle of the fire growing louder with each passing second. Captain Reeves's voice crackled over the radio. "Team, rendezvous at coordinates 46°15 N, 114°09 W. That's our staging area. Move fast but stay safe." As we made our way through the smoky underbrush, the true scale of the fire became apparent. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with ash and embers. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened skeletons, their branches reaching towards the sky like pleading hands. We worked tirelessly through the day, digging fire lines, setting backfires, and battling the relentless advance of the flames. The sun set, but the night brought no relief. If anything, the darkness made our task more daunting, the fire casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist with a life of their own. It was nearing midnight when Captain Reeves made the call. "We need to push further in," he said, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "There's a ridge about 2 miles northeast of here. If we can establish a line there, we might have a chance of containing this thing." Exhausted as we were, no one argued. We gathered our gear and set out, our headlamps cutting weak paths through the smoke-filled night. The forest around us was an alien landscape, familiar shapes rendered strange and threatening by the play of shadows and flame. As we hiked, I found myself walking alongside Ezra. The older man's breathing was labored, but his stride never faltered. "You holding up okay, kid?" he asked between breaths. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The truth was I was running on fumes. Every muscle in my body ached, and the constant assault of heat and smoke was taking its toll. But I'd be damned if I'd be the first to show weakness. Ezra seemed to sense my fatigue. "First rule of smoke jumping," he said, his voice low and gruff. "Know your limits. There's no shame in speaking up if you're pushing too hard. Better that than making a mistake that gets you or someone else killed." I appreciated his concern, but pride kept me silent. We pressed on through the night, the fire an ever-present threat at our backs. Little did I know that the true danger lurking in these woods had nothing to do with the flames we were fighting. The night wore on, each hour blending into the next in a haze of exhaustion and adrenaline. We worked in 2 lines, methodically clearing a path through the burned-out forest. The acrid smell of smoke filled my nostrils, and my eyes stung despite the protective goggles. Every so often a tree would collapse with a thunderous crack, sending showers of embers into the air. I lost track of time, my world narrowing to the rhythm of my tools. Chop, dig, douse, chop, dig, douse. The mantra kept me moving even as my muscles screamed for rest. Around me I could hear the labored breathing of my teammates, all of us pushing ourselves to the limit. It was Ezra's voice that broke through my fatigue-induced trance. "Hold up," he called out, his tone sharp with alarm. "You smell that?" I paused, inhaling deeply. At first all I could detect was the omnipresent odor of burning wood, but then underneath it all there was something else, a scent so foul it made my stomach churn. It was like rotting meat left out in the sun, mixed with something I couldn't quite place. "What the hell is that?" someone muttered behind me. Captain Reeves held up a hand for silence, his eyes scanning the tree line. In the eerie glow of our headlamps his face looked gaunt and haunted. "Could be an animal caught in the fire," he said, but the uncertainty in his voice was clear. We stood there for a moment, frozen in indecision. The smell seemed to be getting stronger, carried on a wind that whispered through the charred branches, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. "There!" I shouted, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. My headlamp beam cut through the smoky air, illuminating a patch of forest just off to our left. At first, all I could make out was a dark shape, half hidden behind a fallen tree. But as we all turned to look, the shape resolved itself into something that made my blood run cold. It was a body, or what was left of one. Ezra was the first to approach, his movements cautious. I followed close behind, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. As we got closer, the full horror of what we were seeing became apparent. The body was stretched out on the forest floor, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. But it wasn't human, at least not entirely. The torso was elongated, covered in patches of dark matted fur. The head was the worst part, a grotesque mix of human and animal features, with a long, wolf-like snout and ears that came to sharp points. "Jesus Christ," Ezra breathed, his usual stoicism shattered by what lay before us. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could form the words, a sound cut through the night, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated through the earth, setting my teeth on edge and raising every hair on my body. We all turned as one, our headlamps sweeping the darkness, and there, just beyond the reach of our lights, I saw them, two glowing yellow eyes, set in a face that haunted my nightmares for years to come. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall at the shoulder. Its body was lean and powerful, covered in the same dark fur as the corpse at our feet. But it was the face that truly terrified me, a twisted amalgamation of wolf and man, with intelligence burning in those unnatural eyes. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stood frozen, locked in a staring contest with a monster straight out of legend. Then, as if a spell had been broken, chaos erupted. "Run!" Captain Reeves bellowed, and we didn't need to be told twice. We scattered, all thoughts of firefighting forgotten in the face of this new, impossible threat. I ran blindly through the burning forest, branches whipping at my face, embers singeing my clothes. Behind me I could hear the creature's pursuit, the heavy thud of its footfalls, the snap of branches as it crashed through the underbrush. My lungs burned, every breath a struggle in the smoke-filled air. But terror lent me speed, pushing me beyond what I thought my limits were. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually I found myself stumbling into a small clearing, my legs finally giving out beneath me. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized with a start that I was alone. The sounds of pursuit had faded, replaced by the omnipresent crackle of the fire. But as I struggled to my feet, I knew with grim certainty that this night was far from over. Somewhere out there in the burning woods, a monster was hunting, and I had no idea if any of my teammates had survived. The realization that I was alone hit me like a physical blow. In the chaos of our flight, I'd become separated from the rest of the team. Now, surrounded by the burning forest, I felt utterly isolated and vulnerable. The creature could be anywhere, lurking just beyond the flickering shadows cast by the flames. I fumbled for my radio, praying that it hadn't been damaged in my headlong flight through the woods. "This is right," I croaked into the receiver, my voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. "Does anyone copy? Over." For a long moment there was nothing but static. Then miraculously a voice crackled through. "Right, this is Reeves. What's your position? Over." Relief flooded through me at the sound of the captain's voice. "I'm not sure, sir," I replied, scanning my surroundings. "I'm in some kind of clearing. There's a large rock formation to the north. Over." "Roger that. Stay put. We'll come to you. Keep your radio on and stay alert. That thing is still out there. Over and out." As the radio fell silent, the full weight of the situation settled over me. I was alone in a burning forest, being hunted by a creature that shouldn't exist. My training had prepared me for many dangers, but nothing like this. I took stock of my situation. My gear was intact. I still had my shovel, my emergency flares, and my canteen. But against whatever that thing was, how much good would they do? The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every snapping twig, every shift of the wind through the trees set my nerves on edge. I kept my back to the rock formation, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. It was during one of these nervous sweeps that I saw it. A flash of yellow eyes in the darkness, there and gone so quickly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But the low growl that followed, barely audible over the crackling of the flames, confirmed my worst fears. The creature was here, watching me, toying with its prey. My hand tightened on the shaft of my shovel, a pathetic weapon against the monstrosity I'd seen earlier, but better than nothing. I considered using one of my flares, but hesitated. The light might scare the creature off, but it would also give away my position to any of my teammates trying to find me. As I stood there, frozen in indecision, a figure burst from the tree line. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought the creature had finally decided to attack. But then I recognized the familiar orange of a firefighter's suit. "Ezra!" I called out, relief flooding through me. The older man stumbled into the clearing, his face a mask of exhaustion and fear. "Kid," he gasped, doubling over to catch his breath. "Thank God, I thought I was the only one left." Before I could respond, another growl ripped through the night, closer this time. Ezra's head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. "It followed me," he whispered. "Oh God, it followed me here." I grabbed his arm, pulling him towards the rock formation at my back. "Come on," I urged. "We need to find a defensible position." We scrambled up the rocks, the rough stones scraping our hands as we climbed. From our elevated position, we had a better view of the clearing and the forest beyond. What we saw made my blood run cold. The creature emerged from the trees with a fluid grace that belied its massive size. In the flickering light of the fire, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more terrifying up close, a nightmarish fusion of wolf and man, with slavering jaws and claws that looked sharp enough to rend steel. It paused at the edge of the clearing, its nose lifted to the air as it scented us. Those intelligent yellow eyes locked onto our position, and I knew with grim certainty that our meager height advantage wouldn't deter it for long. "What do we do?" Ezra whispered, his usual bravado completely evaporated in the face of this impossible threat. I reached for my flares with trembling hands. "We fight," I said, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "And we pray the others find us soon." As if in answer to my words, a shout echoed through the woods. "Right, Ezra, where are you?" The creature's head whipped around, a low growl rumbling from its chest. For a moment it seemed torn between us and the new potential prey. That moment of hesitation was all we needed. "Here!" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "We're here!" I struck the flare, the sudden burst of red light momentarily blinding me. The creature snarled, backing away from the intense glow. Ezra followed suit, igniting his own flare. The clearing was bathed in an eerie, blood-red light that cast long, dancing shadows. "Keep your eyes on it," Ezra muttered, his voice tight with fear. "Don't let it out of your sight." The creature paced at the edge of the clearing, its yellow eyes reflecting the flare light like twin flames. It was waiting, I realized with a chill. Waiting for our meager defenses to fail, for exhaustion to overtake us. It had all the time in the world. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My arms ached from holding the flare aloft, and I could feel my strength waning. Beside me, Ezra's breathing was labored, his face slick with sweat despite the cool night air. Just as I felt my grip on the flare beginning to slip, a crashing sound came from the forest. The creature's head snapped towards the noise, its ears pricked forward. For a heart-stopping moment I feared it was about to retreat into the woods, denying us the small security of keeping it in sight. But then figures burst from the tree line. Captain Reeves and the rest of our team, armed with axes and shovels. They took in the scene with wide eyes, Ezra and me perched on the rocks, flares held high, and the monstrous creature poised at the edge of the clearing. "What in God's name?" Reeves breathed, his usual composure shaken. The creature, outnumbered now, let out a bone-chilling howl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Then, with one last baleful glare in our direction, it turned and loped into the forest, quickly swallowed by the shadows and smoke. For a long moment no one moved. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and our ragged breathing. Then, slowly, Ezra and I climbed down from our perch, our legs shaky with fatigue and fading adrenaline. "Report," Reeves barked, his gruff tone betraying his own shock and fear. Between gasps for breath, Ezra and I recounted what we'd seen. The misshapen corpse in the woods, the monstrous creature that had hunted us through the night. As we spoke, I could see the disbelief on our teammates' faces slowly give way to a grim acceptance. They'd seen the creature too, if only for a moment. There was no denying the reality of what we'd experienced. "We need to get out of here," Reeves said finally, his voice heavy with fatigue and something that might have been defeat. "The fire's beyond our control now, and with that thing out there, it's too dangerous to continue." No one argued. We gathered what equipment we could and began the long trek back to our extraction point. As we walked, huddled close together with our tools held like weapons, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow held potential danger. Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through my body. The sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn when we finally reached the clearing where our rescue chopper waited. As we boarded, I took one last look at the smoke-shrouded forest behind us. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a flash of yellow eyes in the gloom. Then the helicopter lifted off and the woods fell away beneath us. In the days that followed, as we gave our reports and tried to make sense of what had happened, I learned that no trace of the creature was ever found. The body we'd discovered was chalked up to an animal killed in the fire, despite our insistence otherwise. Our encounter was officially classified as a stress-induced group hallucination, a result of exhaustion and the extreme conditions we'd been working under. But I know what I saw. I know what hunted us through that burning forest. And I know that somewhere out there, in the wild places of the world, it still roams. Waiting, watching, hungry. I still work as a firefighter, but I don't do backcountry jumps anymore. Some nights, when the wind howls and shadows flicker at the edge of my vision, I'm transported back to that clearing in the Bitterroot. I feel the heat of the flames, smell the acrid smoke, and hear the low, rumbling growl that haunts my dreams, and I wonder, with a chill that reaches deep into my bones, what other secrets the wilderness holds, what ancient primal forces still lurk in the dark corners of our world, waiting for their moment to emerge. Because now I know the truth. The most terrifying monsters aren't born from our imagination. They're the ones that have always been there, hiding just beyond the reach of our campfires, in the places where civilization gives way to something older and wilder. The beast in the burning woods opened my eyes to a world I never knew existed, a world where legends walk and nightmares breathe. And though I've tried to put that night behind me, to rationalize and forget, a part of me remains forever changed. Because once you've looked into the eyes of the impossible, once you've felt the breath of myth on your neck, you can never truly go back to the world you knew before. So I tell my story to those who'll listen and those who'll scoff, and I warn them, respect the wild places, fear the shadows, and always, always keep your fire burning bright, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the light, waiting for your flame to flicker and die. It's been years since that day in Glacier National Park, Montana, but the memories still haunt me. I've tried to push them away, to convince myself it was all some sort of hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The scars on my body are a constant reminder of the terror I experienced in those woods. My name is Michael Hawkins, and I was 26 years old when it happened. I'd been working as a park ranger at Glacier for about 3 years at that point. It was my dream job, being out in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. I loved the solitude, the quiet, and the breathtaking beauty of the mountains and forests. I was always a bit of a loner, preferring the company of trees and wildlife to most people. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed interacting with the visitors to the park, answering their questions and helping them have a safe and enjoyable experience. But at the end of the day, I was happiest when it was just me and the wilderness. That summer had been particularly busy. Tourist season was in full swing, and we'd had a few incidents with unprepared hikers getting lost or injured. Nothing too serious, thankfully, but it kept us rangers on our toes. By mid-August, things were starting to calm down a bit, and I was looking forward to some quieter patrols. It was on one of these patrols that everything changed. August 17th, 2019, a date that's seared into my memory. The day started like any other. I woke up early in my small cabin on the outskirts of the park, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and reviewed the day's assignments. I was scheduled to check out the South Loop Trail that day. It's one of the less popular trails in the park, winding through some of the older growth forests. I always enjoyed patrolling this area. There was something almost primeval about those ancient trees, their massive trunks stretching up towards the sky, their canopies so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. As I got dressed in my ranger uniform, the familiar olive green shirt and pants, sturdy boots, and wide-brimmed hat, I felt a strange sense of unease. It was subtle, just a slight twisting in my gut, but it was enough to make me pause. I shook it off, chalking it up to the extra strong coffee I'd brewed that morning. I packed my gear for the day: first aid kit, radio, map, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, water, and some high-energy snacks. Standard stuff for a day out on the trails. I also made sure to bring my bear spray, always a necessity in grizzly country. Little did I know how useless it would prove to be against what I was about to encounter. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. It was a beautiful day, clear blue skies with just a few wispy clouds. The sun was warm on my skin as I got out of my truck and double-checked my gear. I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp mountain air and the scent of pine. As I started down the trail, I went through my mental checklist. Look for any signs of erosion or damage to the path. Check for fallen trees or other obstacles. Keep an eye out for any unusual animal activity. It was all routine, something I'd done hundreds of times before. The first mile or so of the trail was open and sunny, winding through meadows dotted with wildflowers. I saw a few hikers, mostly older couples, out for a morning stroll. I chatted with them briefly, reminding them to stay on the marked path and to be aware of wildlife. It was as I moved deeper into the forest that things started to feel off. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a thick canopy that blocked out much of the light. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air became heavy with moisture. I'd been on this trail many times before, but something felt different that day. The usual sounds of the forest bird song, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, seemed muted, almost as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. That's when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a whiff of something unpleasant carried on the breeze. I paused, trying to identify it. It wasn't the normal sense of the forest, not decaying leaves or damp earth. This was different, musky, almost like wet dog, but far stronger and with an underlying note of something I couldn't quite place. I'd received reports from a few hikers over the past week about a strange odor in this area. We'd assumed it was probably a dead animal, maybe a deer or elk that had died off the trail. It wasn't uncommon, especially as we got closer to fall and food became scarcer. I'd made a mental note to keep an eye out for the source of the smell, thinking I might need to arrange for the carcass to be removed if it was too close to the trail. But this didn't smell like any dead animal I'd ever encountered, and believe me, in my years as a ranger, I'd come across my fair share of decomposing wildlife. I continued down the trail, the smell growing stronger with each step. It was becoming almost overwhelming, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to try and lessen the impact. My unease from earlier that morning returned, stronger now, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. That's when I heard it, a sharp crack, like a branch breaking underfoot, coming from just ahead on the trail. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "This is Ranger Hawkins. Is anyone there?" Silence. Not even an echo of my voice came back to me, just that oppressive quiet and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere off in the trees. I took a few cautious steps forward, eyes scanning the underbrush on either side of the trail. The smell was so strong now it was making my eyes water. "If there's someone there, please identify yourself," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. Movement caught my eye, a large, dark shape slipping between the trees to my left. My breath caught in my throat. My first thought was bear, but even as the word formed in my mind, I knew it wasn't right. Whatever I'd seen was too tall, too lean to be a bear. But if not a bear, then what? "Come on out," I said, hating the way my voice shook slightly. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. Just need to make sure everything's okay." Nothing moved. The forest remained silent, save for that constant drip, drip, drip of water. Only, I suddenly realized the sound wasn't coming from off in the trees anymore. It was behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. There was nothing there. Just the empty trail stretching back the way I'd come, dappled shadows playing across the ground. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But years of training kicked in. I was a ranger. It was my job to investigate anything unusual, to ensure the safety of the park and its visitors. I couldn't just run away because I was spooked by a weird smell and some strange noises. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "Okay," I muttered to myself. "Let's think this through logically. What could it be?" As I stood there, running through possibilities in my mind, I became aware of a new sound. A low, rumbling growl, so deep I felt it more than heard it, and it was coming from right behind me. I whirled around, and that's when everything went to hell. Something huge slammed into me, knocking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. Before I could even think about getting up, an enormous weight landed on my chest, pinning me to the forest floor. The stench was overwhelming now, a miasma of musk and rot that made me gag. I caught a glimpse of matted dark fur and teeth. Dear God, the teeth. They were longer than any dog's or wolf's I'd ever seen, yellowed and wickedly sharp. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They glowed in the gloom of the forest, a sickly yellow-green that seemed to pulse with an inner light. They were intelligent eyes, far too intelligent for any animal I'd ever encountered. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that what was on top of me wasn't natural. It wasn't any kind of animal known to science. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. The creature shifted its weight, and I felt claws rake across my chest, tearing through my shirt like it was tissue paper. Pain lanced through me, hot and sharp. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat before I could even think about holding it back. I thrashed wildly, kicking and flailing with every ounce of strength I possessed. It did nothing. The creature didn't even seem to notice my struggles. Its head lowered towards my face, jaws opening to reveal row upon row of those terrible teeth. My hand, scrabbling desperately in the dirt and leaf litter, closed around something solid, a rock. Without conscious thought, I swung it up with all my might, smashing it into the side of the creature's head. It let out a high-pitched yelp of surprise, rearing back slightly. The pressure on my chest lessened just enough for me to draw in a gasping breath. I kicked out, my boot connecting solidly with what I hoped was its snout. The creature stumbled back, giving me just enough room to scramble to my feet. My chest was on fire where its claws had raked me, and I could feel warm blood soaking into what was left of my shirt. But I was up, and that was something. For a moment we just stared at each other. The creature crouched at the edge of the trail, its breath coming in heavy pants that sent clouds of steam into the cool air. Now that I could see it properly, I realized just how massive it was. Standing on its hind legs, it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its fur was thick and wiry, a dark brown that was almost black in places. But it was the head that was truly nightmarish. The muzzle was too long for a wolf or a bear, and those teeth, they were more like a shark's than any land predator I'd ever seen. My hand went to my radio, fumbling with the controls. The creature watched me, its head cocked to one side as if it was curious about what I was doing. Then it took a step forward, and another. "Go away!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. "Leave me alone!" The creature's only response was a low growl, its lips curling back to reveal even more of those terrible teeth. It took another step towards me. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a root. I went down hard, my radio flying from my grasp and disappearing into the underbrush. My back slammed against a tree trunk, and suddenly there was nowhere left to go. The creature was on me in an instant. I threw up my arms in a pathetic attempt to defend myself, but it was useless. Claws raked down my forearms, leaving bloody furrows in their wake. I screamed again, the sound echoing through the trees. Just when I thought it was over, that this was how I was going to die, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. 2 hikers had emerged onto the trail just yards away. They stood frozen, staring at the scene before them with expressions of utter disbelief. "Help!" I managed to choke out, still struggling against the creature's onslaught. "Help me!" The creature paused, turning its head to look at the newcomers. For a moment everything was still. Then the hikers turned and ran, their screams fading as they disappeared back down the trail. The creature looked back at me, and I swear I saw its snarl morph into something like a grin. Then, in a blur of motion almost too fast to follow, it was gone. It vanished into the trees, taking that awful stench with it. I slumped against the tree trunk, my body on fire with pain, blood seeping from numerous wounds. I was alive, but I had no idea how or why. Why had the creature attacked me? Why had it fled when the hikers appeared? And most importantly, what in God's name was it? The next few hours passed in a haze of pain and confusion. I vaguely remember other rangers finding me, the flashing lights of an ambulance, the sterile whites and grays of a hospital room. I told my story over and over, to my fellow rangers, to the police, to the doctors. Nobody believed me, of course. They said it must have been a bear attack, or maybe a mountain lion. They told me I was in shock, that my mind was playing tricks on me. They said I was lucky to be alive. But I know what I saw. I know what attacked me that day wasn't any normal animal. The nightmares that have plagued me ever since. the way I break out in a cold sweat every time I catch a whiff of that musky scent. These aren't the results of an encounter with a bear. I left my job as a ranger not long after that. I couldn't bear to go back into those woods, knowing what might be lurking in the shadows. I moved to the city, surrounded myself with concrete and steel and electric lights. But even here, miles away from Glacier National Park, I can't escape the memory of those glowing eyes and gleaming teeth. Sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I swear I can hear that low, rumbling growl. And I wonder, is it out there still, that thing in the woods? How many other hikers and rangers has it encountered? How many weren't as lucky as I was? I don't have any answers. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely tread. And if you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness, and you catch a whiff of that musky, rotting smell, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because the thing in the woods is real, and it's hungry. The weeks following the attack were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and sleepless nights. The physical wounds healed faster than I expected, but the mental scars, those were another story entirely. I was released from the hospital after a week, my chest and arms wrapped in bandages, a prescription for painkillers in my pocket. The doctors had been amazed at how quickly I was healing. "You're lucky," they kept saying. "A bear attack like that could have been fatal." But I knew it wasn't a bear. No matter how many times I told my story, to the rangers, to the police, to the park administration, no one believed me. They nodded politely, made notes in their little notebooks, and then went right back to talking about rogue bears and the need for better wildlife management. Even my fellow rangers, people I'd worked alongside for years, looked at me with doubt in their eyes. I could see it in their faces. They thought I was crazy or lying or both. The only person who seemed to take me seriously was Angela, one of the newer rangers. She'd started working at Glacier just a few months before my encounter. Angela was different from the others, quieter, more observant. She had a background in wildlife biology and had spent time studying cryptozoology as a hobby. It was Angela who first approached me about the possibility that what I'd seen wasn't just a bear or mountain lion. "I believe you, Michael," she said one evening about 2 weeks after the attack. We were sitting on the porch of my cabin watching the sun set behind the mountains. "I've heard stories, things that don't add up. You're not the first person to report something strange in these woods." I looked at her, a mix of hope and fear churning in my gut. "What do you mean?" Angela leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There have been disappearances over the years, hikers who went out and never came back, rangers who quit suddenly with no explanation, and always reports of that same smell you described." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm evening air. "Why hasn't anyone investigated this?" She shrugged, looking out at the darkening forest. "People have tried, but evidence disappears, reports get buried. It's like something doesn't want us looking too closely." We talked late into the night, Angela sharing what she knew, me filling in the gaps with the details of my encounter. By the time she left, I felt both vindicated and terrified. I wasn't crazy. Something was out there. But now that I knew, what was I supposed to do about it? The next few months were a whirlwind of research and covert investigation. Angela and I spent every free moment digging into the history of Glacier National Park and the surrounding areas. We pored over old newspapers, interviewed longtime residents, and even reached out to experts in cryptozoology and folklore. What we found was disturbing, to say the least. The first recorded sighting of something matching our creature dated back to the early 1800s, long before Glacier became a national park. A fur trapper wrote in his journal about encountering a great beast taller than a man with eyes that glowed like hellfire. The trapper barely escaped with his life and refused to return to the area. Similar accounts popped up sporadically over the years. A group of miners in 1887 abandoned a promising claim after reporting attacks by a demon wolf. In 1923, a park ranger went missing for 3 days, only to return babbling about a monster in the woods. He was quietly dismissed, his reports buried in the archives. The pattern continued right up to the present day. Every few years, someone would report an encounter similar to mine, but the stories were always dismissed, explained away, or simply buried. As we dug deeper, Angela and I began to notice other patterns. The encounters seemed to cluster around certain areas of the park, particularly the older growth forests, and they often coincided with periods of unusual seismic activity in the region. "What if," Angela proposed one night, her eyes bright with excitement and fear, "what if this thing isn't just some undiscovered animal? What if it's something older, something that's been here long before us?" The idea was terrifying, but it made a strange sort of sense. It would explain why the creature seemed so intelligent, why it could appear and disappear so quickly, why it had left me alive when it clearly could have killed me. But our investigation didn't go unnoticed. About 6 months after my attack, I was called into the chief ranger's office. He was a gruff man named Tom Hawkins, no relation, who'd been running Glacier for over a decade. "Hawkins," he said, not looking up from the papers on his desk, "I'm going to be blunt. Your obsession with this monster of yours is becoming a problem. You're scaring visitors, worrying the other rangers, and frankly, you're making us all look bad." I tried to protest, to explain what Angela and I had discovered, but he cut me off. "Enough. I don't want to hear it. You've got 2 choices here. You can drop this nonsense, get your head on straight, and get back to doing your job. Or you can turn in your badge. Your choice." I left his office in a daze. I knew I couldn't just forget what had happened, couldn't ignore what Angela and I had uncovered. But I also couldn't bear the thought of leaving Glacier. This park had been my home, my life, for years. In the end, the decision was made for me. It was a crisp autumn evening, just over 7 months after my encounter. Angela and I had planned to meet at my cabin to go over some new information she'd uncovered, but she never showed up. I waited for an hour, then 2. As the sky darkened and a chill settled over the forest, I knew something was wrong. I tried her radio, her cell phone, nothing. With a growing sense of dread, I grabbed my gear and headed out into the night. I knew I should call for backup, alert the other rangers, but something told me there wasn't time. I made my way to the South Loop Trail, the site of my original encounter. As I got closer, that familiar, musky scent began to fill the air. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Not if Angela was in danger. I found her pack first, torn and bloody, lying just off the trail. Then I heard it, a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Angela!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "Angela, where are you?" A scream answered me, high and panicked, coming from deeper in the forest. I plunged off the trail, crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight beam dancing crazily across the trees. I burst into a small clearing and froze. There in the center was the creature. It was even larger than I remembered, its massive form hunched over a prone figure on the ground. "Angela!" Without thinking, I charged forward, yelling at the top of my lungs. The creature's head snapped up, those terrible yellow eyes fixing on me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, to my amazement, it backed away from Angela. I rushed to her side. She was alive but badly injured, deep claw marks scoring her legs and torso. I pulled off my jacket, trying to staunch the bleeding. A low growl made me look up. The creature was still there, watching us, but it made no move to attack. Instead, it seemed almost curious. "What are you?" I found myself asking, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" To my shock, the creature cocked its head, almost as if it understood me. Then slowly, deliberately, it turned and loped off into the darkness. I don't remember much of what happened next. I somehow managed to get Angela back to the trail to call for help. The next few days were a whirlwind of hospital visits, police interviews, and difficult conversations with the park administration. In the end, I did leave Glacier National Park. Not because I was fired, but because I chose to go. I knew I couldn't stay, couldn't pretend everything was normal when I knew what was out there in the woods. Angela recovered from her injuries, but like me, she couldn't bring herself to return to work at the park. We stayed in touch, continuing our research from afar, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. Years have passed since then. I've traveled to other wilderness areas, other national parks, following reports of similar creatures. I've connected with others who've had encounters like mine, building a network of believers and investigators. And always, I find myself drawn back to Glacier. I'll stand at the edge of those familiar forests, breathing in the scent of pine and watching the shadows move between the trees. And I'll wonder, is it still out there? Is it watching me even now? I don't have answers, not really, but I know what I saw, what I experienced. I know there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the dark places where few humans venture. So if you find yourself in the wilderness, in those old growth forests where the trees grow thick and the shadows run deep, be careful, be aware. And if you catch a whiff of that musky, rotting smell, don't dismiss it. Don't explain it away, because the thing in the woods is real. It's out there watching and waiting, and next time, you might not be as lucky as I was. It's been a couple of years since that day, but the memory still sends chills down my spine. I've never shared the full story before, but I feel like it's time to put it all down. Maybe writing it out will help me make sense of what happened, or at least get it off my chest. Back then, I was living in the Florida Panhandle, working at a small marina called Gulf Breeze Boat Repairs. It wasn't glamorous work by any means, but it kept me close to the water, which I'd always loved. My days were filled with the smell of salt air, the sound of seagulls, and the constant hum of boat engines. I did everything from changing oil to repairing fiberglass hulls, whatever needed doing to keep the local fishing boats and pleasure crafts running smoothly. My co-worker and fast friend Randall Johnson was a lifelong local. He was in his mid-50s with weathered skin that spoke of decades spent under the Florida sun. Randall had this way of moving around boats that made it look effortless, like he was born on the water. His stories of the local waters were legendary around the marina, and I hung on every word. It was late August, and the oppressive heat of the summer was just starting to lose its edge. The tourist season was winding down, which meant our workload at the marina had eased up a bit. Randall and I had been pulling long hours all summer, and we were both feeling the need for a break. One Wednesday afternoon, as we were finishing up work on an old fishing trawler, Randall turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Hey," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You up for a little adventure tomorrow? I know this spot a few miles down the coast. Locals say the fishing's been incredible lately." I was intrigued. "What kind of spot are we talking about?" Randall grinned. "It's this little island. Well, more of a glorified sandbar, really. Gets cut off at high tide. Not many people know about it, and those who do tend to keep it to themselves. I've been meaning to check it out for ages." The prospect of a day away from the grind of boat maintenance was too good to pass up. "Count me in," I said, already imagining the feel of a fishing rod in my hands. We made plans to meet at the marina early the next morning. I spent that evening gathering my gear, my trusty fishing rod, a small cooler for our catch, and of course a six-pack of beer. As I packed, I couldn't shake this feeling of excitement mixed with a touch of unease. I chalked it up to anticipation for the trip, but looking back, maybe it was something more. The next morning dawned clear and bright. I arrived at the marina just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water. Randall was already there, loading supplies onto his small motorboat, a beat-up 18-footer he'd owned for years. "Morning," he called out as I approached. "Ready for some world-class fishing?" I grinned, holding up my gear. "Born ready. Let's do this." We set out as the sky shifted from pink to blue, the boat cutting through the calm waters of the early morning. Randall navigated with the confidence of someone who knew these waters like the back of his hand. As we traveled, he pointed out landmarks and shared snippets of local history. "See that old lighthouse over there?" he said, gesturing to a weathered structure in the distance. "They say it's haunted. Back in the 30s, the keeper went mad and—" He launched into a gruesome tale that had me laughing and shuddering in equal measure. After about an hour of travel, Randall began to slow the boat. "We're getting close," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Should be just around this bend." As we rounded a small peninsula, I saw it. The island was exactly as Randall had described, more of an oversized sandbar than anything else. It was maybe a quarter-mile long and 100 yards across at its widest point. A handful of scraggly trees clung to life near its center, their branches twisted by years of coastal winds. "There she is," Randall said with a note of pride in his voice. "Told you it wasn't much to look at, but trust me, the fishing makes up for it." We anchored the boat a short distance from shore and waded through the shallow water, carrying our gear. The sand was warm beneath our feet as we set up our spot near the tree line. The air was filled with the cries of seabirds and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. "All right," Randall said, cracking open a beer. "Let's see what we can catch." We cast our lines and settled in. For the first hour or so, it was exactly the relaxing day we'd hoped for. We talked about work, swapped stories, and enjoyed the peace of being away from it all. Then, almost as if someone had flipped a switch, the fish started biting. I'm not exaggerating when I say I've never experienced anything like it. We were pulling in fish after fish, mostly red drum and speckled trout, with the occasional flounder mixed in. It was like the fish were competing to see who could get caught first. "Holy shit," I laughed as I reeled in yet another red drum. "You weren't kidding about this place." Randall beamed, clearly pleased with himself. "What'd I tell you? Best kept secret in the Panhandle." As the day wore on, our cooler filled up, and our supply of beer dwindled. The sun began its descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. We were both riding high on the success of our fishing expedition, laughing and joking as we reminisced about some of the more colorful characters we'd encountered at the marina. That's when things started to get strange. I was in the middle of telling Randall about a customer who'd tried to convince us his boat engine had been cursed by a sea witch, when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. One of our empty beer cans, sitting in the sand about 10 feet away, moved. Just a little twitch, like something had bumped it. At first I didn't think much of it. The breeze had picked up as evening approached, and I figured a gust of wind had caught it. But then it happened again, this time with a different can. This one didn't just twitch, it rolled a good foot across the sand. I frowned, my story forgotten. "Hey, Randall," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "You seeing this?" Randall, who had been cleaning his latest catch, looked up. "Seeing what?" "The cans," I said, pointing. "They're moving." He squinted in the direction I was pointing, then chuckled. "Think you've had a few too many there, buddy. Tide's probably just coming in early." I shook my head, a creeping unease settling in my stomach. "No, man, I'm serious. Look." As if on cue, another can lifted clean off the ground. It hung in the air for a moment, suspended by some invisible force, then dropped back to the sand with a soft thud. Randall's laughter died in his throat. We both stared at the scattered cans, neither of us wanting to be the first to admit what we'd just seen. "Okay," Randall said slowly, his voice low. "That was weird." I nodded, my eyes scanning the area around us. The island suddenly felt a lot smaller, and the encroaching darkness a lot more ominous. "Maybe we should pack up," I suggested, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "It's getting late anyway." Randall didn't argue. We started gathering our things, moving with a forced casualness that did little to mask our growing unease. I kept glancing at the cans, half expecting to see them dancing across the sand. We were almost finished packing when I heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from the direction of the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Randall," I whispered, "did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale in the fading light. "Probably just the wind in the trees," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. The scraping came again, louder this time. It sounded like something dragging across bark, punctuated by a low, guttural sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. "Fuck this," Randall muttered. "Let's go. Now." We abandoned any pretense of calm, grabbing our remaining gear and making a beeline for the boat. The water felt colder now, more threatening as we waded out to where we'd anchored. I chanced to glance back at the island as Randall started the engine. What I saw nearly made my heart stop. There, at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin, if you could call it that, was dark and mottled, blending with the shadows around it. But it was the head that truly chilled me to my core. It was elongated, almost canine in shape, with eyes that glowed faintly in the gathering darkness. Jesus Christ, I heard Randall breathe beside me. He'd seen it too. The creature took a step forward, its movement unnaturally fluid. That was all we needed to see. Randall gunned the engine and we took off, leaving a wake that crashed against the shore of the godforsaken island. Neither of us spoke as we sped back towards the mainland. The sound of the engine and the splash of water against the hull seemed impossibly loud in the gathering night. I kept looking back, half expecting to see that thing swimming after us or maybe standing on the water's surface. But there was nothing, just the darkening sea and the distant silhouette of the island fading into the night. It wasn't until we were safely back at the marina, tying up the boat with shaking hands, that Randall finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to find the words. How could I describe something that defied explanation? "I don't know," I finally managed, "but I never want to see it again." We agreed then and there that we wouldn't speak of what had happened. Who would believe us anyway? We'd sound like a couple of drunks who'd had too much sun and too many beers. But we both knew what we'd seen, and it changed us. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively checking local news sources, half expecting to read about some horrific animal attack or a missing person last seen heading towards that stretch of coastline. But there was nothing. Life in the small coastal community went on as if nothing had happened. Randall and I never went fishing together again after that day. We still worked side by side at the marina, but there was a tension between us now, an unspoken agreement to never mention that day on the island. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out at the water with a haunted look in his eyes, and I knew he was thinking about it too. I left the Panhandle about 6 months later, told myself it was for a better job opportunity up north, but deep down, I knew I was running. From what, I couldn't say exactly. Memories? The possibility of encountering that thing again? Or maybe just the knowledge that the world was a lot stranger and more terrifying than I'd ever imagined. It's been years now, and I've tried to put that day behind me. But sometimes when the wind howls outside my window, or I catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, I'm right back on that island. I see those glowing eyes in the darkness, that impossible figure emerging from the trees. And I wonder, what if it followed us back that day? What if it's out there still, lurking in the places we don't look too closely at, waiting for someone else to stumble upon its island? I don't know if I'll ever have answers to these questions. Part of me hopes I never will. But I do know one thing for certain. I'll never set foot on another unnamed island again. Some secrets I've learned are better left undiscovered. The sun was setting over the San Francisco peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. I stood on my small balcony, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the light fade. It was a ritual of mine, this quiet moment at day's end, a time to reflect on the beauty that surrounded me here in Flagstaff, Arizona. My name is Jason, and I've called this mountain town home for the better part of a decade. I moved here right after college, drawn by the promise of endless outdoor adventures and a lifestyle that valued connection to nature over the rat race of big city living. It was a decision I'd never regretted, even on the toughest days. Flagstaff sits at an elevation of around 7,000 feet, nestled among ponderosa pine forests and high desert plateaus. The air here is thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and sun-baked earth. It's a town where you're as likely to see someone carrying climbing gear as a briefcase, where weekend plans almost always involve some form of outdoor activity. For me, that activity was hiking. I'd always been drawn to the trails, even as a kid growing up in suburban Phoenix. But it wasn't until I moved to Flagstaff that hiking became more than just a hobby. It became a way of life. There was something about the solitude of the trails, the physical challenge of pushing my body, and the raw beauty of unspoiled wilderness that spoke to my soul in a way nothing else could. Over the years, I'd explored countless trails in the area, from the well-trodden paths of the Kachina Peaks wilderness to obscure game trails that barely qualified as hikeable. I'd seen it all, or so I thought. It was that confidence, that belief that I knew these woods better than most, that would eventually lead me into a nightmare I still struggle to comprehend. As I finished my coffee and headed back inside my small apartment, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Orson, a buddy I'd met a few years back at a local gear swap. "Hey man, you up for a challenge this weekend? Found a trail that'll make your legs burn and your eyes pop." I grinned, already feeling the familiar surge of excitement that came with the prospect of a new adventure. Orson was always finding these off-the-beaten-path trails, the kind that didn't show up on any official maps. It was one of the reasons we'd hit it off so well. I'd met Orson at a time when I was starting to feel like I'd conquered every worthwhile trail in the area. He was new in town, a transplant from somewhere back east, but he had a knack for sniffing out the kind of hikes that rekindled my passion for exploration. He was a bit of a city slicker, more comfortable with tech than topographical maps, but his enthusiasm was infectious. "You know I'm always game," I texted back. "What have you got in mind?" As I waited for his response, I found myself reflecting on our friendship. Orson and I were an odd pair in many ways. Where I was all about minimalism and roughing it, he was the guy who always had the latest gear, even if he didn't always know how to use it properly. But we shared a love for pushing our limits, for seeking out the paths less traveled. My phone buzzed again. "It's just outside of town, maybe 30 minutes drive. Supposed to have some killer views of the peaks. You free Saturday?" "Count me in," I replied, already mentally cataloging the gear I'd need for the hike. Little did I know that this seemingly routine exchange was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about these mountains, about nature itself, and about the thin line between the world we think we understand and the terrifying unknown that lurks just beyond our perception. As I started pulling out my hiking gear, checking my boots and packing my usual supplies, I had no idea that in just a few days I'd be running for my life through those same forests I'd come to see as a second home. I couldn't have known that the bone-chilling fear I was about to experience would haunt me for years to come, making me question every shadow, every unexpected sound in the wilderness I once found so comforting. But that's getting ahead of the story. For now, I was just Jason, an avid hiker looking forward to another weekend adventure with a good friend. The horrors that awaited us were still unimaginable, hidden behind the veil of normality that we all take for granted. As I zipped up my pack and set it by the door, ready for an early start on Saturday, I paused for a moment. Something felt different about this upcoming hike, a subtle unease that I couldn't quite place. I shook it off, chalking it up to simple excitement for exploring a new trail. If only I'd listened to that faint warning bell in the back of my mind. If only I'd known what waited for us out there in the woods, but I didn't know, couldn't have known. And so, blissfully ignorant, I went to bed that night, dreaming of mountain vistas and the satisfaction of conquering a challenging new trail. The nightmare was still days away, but with every passing minute, we were drawing closer to an encounter that would change our lives forever. The rest of the week crawled by, each day at my job as a graphic designer for a local outdoor gear company, feeling longer than the last. By Friday evening, I was more than ready for our weekend adventure. I spent that night meticulously packing and repacking my backpack, a ritual that always calmed my pre-hike jitters. Water bladder, first aid kit, multi-tool, headlamp, extra socks, rain shell, just in case, map, compass, and of course my trusty DSLR camera. I'd learned long ago that in the backcountry, being over-prepared was far better than the alternative. As I was double-checking my gear, my phone buzzed with another text from Orson. "Dude, you're gonna love this trail. Did some digging. It's not on any official maps. Local guy told me about it. Says it's a real hidden gem." I felt a mix of excitement and unease at this news. Off-map trails could be incredible, offering views and experiences you couldn't get on the popular routes. But they also came with risks, less maintenance, no rangers patrolling, and the potential for getting seriously lost if you weren't careful. "Sounds intense," I texted back. "You sure we're up for it?" Orson's reply came quickly. "Trust me, we've got this. I've got the route mapped on my GPS app. What could go wrong?" If only I'd known then how much could, in fact, go wrong. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. Saturday morning arrived with a chill in the air, unusual for early September in Flagstaff. As I loaded my pack into my weathered Subaru Outback, I noticed a thin layer of frost on the windshield. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, bathing the town in a soft golden light that made everything look slightly surreal. I picked Orson up at his apartment complex on the outskirts of town. He looked excited but a little nervous, fumbling with his oversized backpack as he tried to wedge it into my already gear-filled car. "Morning, Jason," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Ready for an adventure?" I nodded, trying to shake off a lingering sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. "Born ready. You got the directions to the trailhead?" Orson pulled out his smartphone, waving it triumphantly. "All set. It's about a 30-minute drive north, then we leave the main road and take a Forest Service road for another 15 minutes or so." As we drove out of town, the familiar landscape of Flagstaff gave way to denser forest. The paved road eventually turned to gravel, then to a rutted dirt track that had my Subaru creaking in protest. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches scraping against the roof of the car. "You sure this is the right way?" I asked, peering through the windshield at the increasingly rough terrain. Orson glanced at his phone, then out the window. "Yeah, should be just up ahead. The guy said there's a small clearing where we can park." Sure enough, after another bone-jarring 5 minutes, we came upon a small opening in the trees. It was barely big enough for 2 cars, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Tall grass and young saplings were starting to reclaim the space. We parked and got out, stretching and adjusting our packs. The forest around us was eerily quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the soft sighing of wind through the pines. "Trail should start just over there," Orson said, pointing to a barely visible break in the trees. I squinted, trying to make out any sign of a path. "You sure about this, man? Doesn't look like anyone's been through here in ages." Orson shrugged, but I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "That's what makes it an adventure, right? Come on, it'll be fine." I hesitated for a moment, that nagging feeling of unease growing stronger. But then I thought of all the amazing hikes we'd been on, all the incredible views we'd seen. What was one more challenge? "All right," I said, adjusting my pack. "Let's do this." As we pushed through the undergrowth towards the supposed trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced back at the car, suddenly looking very small and vulnerable in the clearing. For a brief moment I considered suggesting we turn back, find a more established trail. But then Orson let out an excited whoop. "Found it! Look, there's an old blaze on this tree. We're definitely on the right track." I moved closer, examining the faded yellow mark on the tree trunk. It was old, nearly grown over, but unmistakably a trail marker. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Guess we're really doing this. Lead on, Columbus." And with that, we plunged into the forest, leaving behind the last vestiges of the world we knew. The trees seemed to close in behind us, and as we moved deeper into the wilderness, I couldn't help but feel we were crossing some invisible boundary, stepping from the realm of the known into a world where ancient primal forces still held sway. Little did we know, those forces were about to make themselves known in the most terrifying way imaginable. The trail, if you could call it that, was little more than a game path winding its way through the dense undergrowth. Orson led the way, his eyes glued to the GPS on his phone, while I kept watch for trailblazes or any other signs that humans had passed this way before. The forest around us seemed to grow denser with each step. The towering pines blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, and an oppressive silence hung over everything. "You know," I said, breaking the quiet, "I've hiked all over these mountains, but I've never seen a forest quite like this." Orson glanced back at me, his face sheened with sweat despite the cool air. "Yeah, it's different. But that's what we wanted, right? Something new?" I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that different didn't begin to cover it. The trees here seemed older, more gnarled. Moss hung from the branches in long, beard-like strands, and the undergrowth was a tangle of ferns and shrubs I didn't recognize. We hiked for what felt like hours, the landscape barely changing. My usual trail markers, distinctive rock formations, clearings, changes in vegetation, were absent. It was as if we were walking through the same stretch of forest over and over again. "Orson," I called out, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the still air. "How much farther to this viewpoint?" He stopped, frowning at his phone. "Should be just ahead, maybe another mile or so." I was about to suggest we take a break when something caught my eye, a glint of white among the endless green and brown of the forest floor. "Hold up," I said, moving off the path. "I think I see something." As I approached, the object became clearer. Nestled among the ferns and leaf litter was a bone. But not just any bone. This was large, far too large to belong to any animal I knew lived in these woods. I crouched down, my hand hovering over the bone. It was pristine, bleached white, as if it had been lying in the sun for years, not hidden under the forest canopy. And there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. The bone had an odd shape to it, with a knobby protrusion at one end that looked disturbingly human. "Orson," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." He crashed through the undergrowth towards me, his face lighting up with curiosity. "What did you find? Some cool rock or, oh?" His voice trailed off as he saw the bone. We both stared at it in silence for a long moment. That's not normal, right?" Orson finally said. "I mean, what kind of animal would that even come from?" I shook my head, unable to tear my eyes away from the bone. "I don't know. But whatever it was big, really big." A rational part of my mind was screaming at me to leave it alone, to get back on the trail and forget we ever saw it. But another part, the part that had always pushed me to explore, to seek out the unknown, was fascinated. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and picked up the bone. It was surprisingly light for its size, and smooth to the touch. As I turned it over in my hands, I noticed strange markings along one side. They looked almost like teeth marks, but not from any animal I'd ever encountered. "We should leave it," Orson said, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by clear unease. "Come on, Jason, let's just get to the viewpoint and head back." I knew he was right. Every instinct was telling me to put the bone back, to get out of this strange, silent forest as fast as we could. But something stopped me. Call it curiosity, call it stubbornness, call it sheer foolishness. Whatever it was, it led me to make a decision I would regret for the rest of my life. "Let's check it out a bit more," I said, slipping the bone into my pack. "Maybe there are more. Could be some kind of archaeological site or something." Orson looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment he just shrugged. "All right, but not for long. This place is starting to give me the creeps." As we moved deeper into the forest, away from our already faint trail, the trees seemed to press in closer. The silence grew, if possible, even more profound. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. We had no way of knowing then, but we had just crossed a line. We had taken something that didn't belong to us, and in doing so, we had attracted the attention of something ancient and terrifying. Something that had been waiting in these woods for a very, very long time. The real horror of our hike was about to begin. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the air grew thick and heavy. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The bone in my pack felt heavier with each step, as if it was pulling me down into the earth. Suddenly, Orson froze. "Did you hear that?" I stopped, straining my ears. At first, there was nothing but the eerie silence that had accompanied us throughout the hike. Then I heard it, a soft, dry sound like branches snapping underfoot. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Orson. But it wasn't a deer. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Jason," Orson whispered, his face pale, "we need to go, now." I nodded, slowly turning back the way we came. That's when I saw it. In a small clearing not 10 yards away stood a creature that defied description. It was tall, at least 7 feet, but hunched over as if its shoulders carried a great weight. Its skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tight over a gaunt frame. Patchy, mangy fur hung off it in clumps, but it was the face that froze the blood in my veins. a long, pointed muzzle filled with far too many teeth, and the eyes, black as pitch, but glinting with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. In its clawed hands it held something that made my stomach lurch, a human leg, the hiking boot still attached, the bone picked clean. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We stood frozen, locked in a staring contest with this impossible creature. Then it let out a snarl that sounded like 1,000 nails on a chalkboard, and lunged towards us. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Orson ahead of me. We tore through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the undergrowth, its snarls growing closer with each passing second. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. Orson stumbled, and I grabbed his arm, yanking him back to his feet. "Don't stop!" I gasped. We burst through a thicket and found ourselves at the edge of a steep ravine. Without hesitation, we half ran, half slid down the slope, loose rocks and dirt cascading around us. At the bottom, we spotted a narrow crevice in the rock face. "There," I pointed, and we squeezed into the tight space just as the creature reached the top of the ravine. Its roar of frustration echoed off the rocks as we pressed ourselves as far back into the crevice as we could. I could hear it scrabbling at the entrance, its claws scraping against the stone, but it was too large to follow us in. For hours we huddled in that cramped space, barely daring to breathe. Eventually the sounds of the creature faded, but we waited until the first light of dawn before we dared to emerge. Battered, bruised, and in shock, we somehow found our way back to the car. The hike that had taken hours on the way in seemed to pass in a blur on the way out. Neither of us spoke. We were too focused on putting as much distance between us and that thing as possible. It wasn't until we were back on the main road, the familiar outskirts of Flagstaff coming into view, that the reality of what had happened began to sink in. What was that thing?" Orson finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I don't know if I want to know." We debated going to the authorities, but who would believe us? A monster in the woods? We'd be laughed out of the station. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves, a secret that would bind us together and haunt us for years to come. That hike changed everything. Orson moved away within a month, unable to bear the sight of the mountains that had once been so inviting. As for me, I stayed, but I was a changed man. I still hiked, but never alone, and never off the well-traveled paths. Every snapping twig, every shadow in the trees sent my heart racing. The bone I had so foolishly taken remained hidden in the back of my closet, a constant reminder of the terror we had faced. Nights were the worst. In my dreams, I was back in that forest, running from something I couldn't see but knew was there. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the creature's snarl echoing in my ears. Years passed, and slowly the intensity of the memories began to fade. But I never forgot. How could I? There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our reality. I had seen one, faced it, and somehow survived. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the pines, I think I hear that snarl again, and I wonder, is it still out there waiting? And what would happen if it ever decided to venture beyond its forest domain? I don't have answers to these questions, and part of me hopes I never will. But I know one thing for certain: the wilderness I once thought I knew so well holds secrets darker and more terrifying than I ever could have imagined. So if you're ever hiking in the mountains around Flagstaff, stick to the trails. And if you see something glinting in the underbrush, something that doesn't belong, leave it be. Some things are better left undisturbed, some boundaries better left uncrossed, because out there in the deep dark woods, something is waiting, and it's hungry. It all started in 1992, during the peak of what I can only describe as my worst year. I was a wildlife photographer, barely scraping by on freelance jobs, struggling to make rent for my tiny, run-down apartment in Philadelphia. The irony wasn't lost on me. a nature photographer living in the concrete jungle surrounded by more pigeons than people. But that's where the work was, or at least where I could find enough of it to keep my head above water. My name is Michael Lawson, and at 32 I wasn't exactly living the dream I'd envisioned when I first picked up a camera. Sure, I spent more time outdoors than most, which is where I felt most comfortable. Isolated, where nothing human could bother me. But the constant financial stress, the uncertainty of when the next job would come, it was wearing me down. That's why when an opportunity came knocking in late October, I jumped at it without a second thought. A wildlife conservation group was offering a nice payout for documenting rare bird species in the thick woods of northern Wisconsin. They needed high-quality photographs for an upcoming publication on endangered avian species in the Midwest. The job would require spending at least 2 weeks in the Chequamegon National Forest, far from any signs of civilization. For most people, the idea of being alone in the wilderness for that long might seem daunting. For me, it sounded like paradise. No noisy neighbors, no bill collectors calling, just me and nature. Plus, I desperately needed the money. My landlord had been giving me the evil eye lately, and I was pretty sure my electricity was about to be cut off. I packed my gear, my trusty Nikon F4 with a selection of lenses, enough film to last me a month, just in case, and the bare essentials for survival in the woods. A part of me felt guilty for being excited about this job when so many were struggling. The recession had hit hard, and here I was, heading off into the wilderness, while others fought to keep their homes and feed their families. The journey to Wisconsin was uneventful. A long bus ride followed by a bumpy drive in a beat-up rental car that had seen better days. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me, their autumn colors a vibrant mix of reds, oranges, and yellows. It was beautiful, but there was something oppressive about it too, like the forest was watching me, an intruder in its domain. I arrived at my designated cabin just as the sun was setting. The place was as primitive as they come. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. A small one-room structure made of rough-hewn logs, with a tin roof that I was sure would be deafening in the rain. Inside there was a narrow cot, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a potbelly stove for heat and cooking. An outhouse stood about 20 feet away, and a well pump was located near the cabin's only door. This didn't bother me. I had done this countless times, and solitude came naturally to me. As I unpacked my gear and settled in for the night, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Here in this isolated cabin, my problems seemed a world away. Little did I know that in a few short days, I'd be longing for those simple worries about rent and bills. The first few days were uneventful, almost peaceful. I'd wake up at dawn, grab my camera gear, and head out into the forest. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot and the occasional deer breaking the silence were my only companions. I spotted several of the bird species on my list, a pair of cerulean warblers, a few Kirtland's warblers, and even a glimpse of the elusive golden-winged warbler. Each sighting was carefully documented, each photo meticulously composed. But as the days wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started small, a rustle in the underbrush that seemed too heavy for a squirrel, a shadow moving just at the edge of my vision. I chalked it up to my imagination at first. After all, being alone in the woods for days on end can play tricks on your mind. It wasn't until the 5th night that I realized something was genuinely wrong. I woke up in the early hours around 3 a.m. to a sound I couldn't quite place. It was a sort of heavy breathing followed by rhythmic steps circling the cabin. My first thought was that it must be a bear, curious about the strange new structure in its territory. But as I lay there, listening intently, I realized this was different. The footsteps were too deliberate, too calculated. They stopped and started like someone or something was watching, assessing. I'd been around wildlife my whole life, and nothing I'd encountered moved like that. It wasn't just some animal wandering by. This felt purposeful. My pulse quickened as I sat up, straining my ears to track the movement outside. I grabbed the flashlight from beside the bed and swung my legs over the edge, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. Every part of me wanted to ignore it, to pull the covers over my head and pretend it was just my imagination running wild. But I knew better. I'd heard coyotes, bears, wolves. None of them moved like this. Taking a deep breath, I stood up and moved towards the cabin's only window. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. As I peered out into the night, I caught a glimpse of something darting between the trees. It moved faster than I could comprehend, a dark blur against the moonlit forest. Whatever it was large, too big to be a wolf, but too quick to be a bear. I didn't get a good look, but my instincts were screaming that this wasn't something I wanted to be chasing in the dark. I retreated from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I checked the door, making sure it was securely locked, then did the same with the shutters on the window. As soon as I finished securing the cabin, the footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting on the edge of my cot with the flashlight in one hand and my hunting knife in the other. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. In the light of day, my fears from the night before seemed almost silly. But as I stepped outside to start my day, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth around the cabin, were tracks I couldn't identify. They were large, almost like a bear's, but the shape was all wrong. The claws that had left deep gouges in the soil were too long, too curved. I stood there for a long moment, staring at those tracks and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A part of me wanted to pack up right then and there, to forget about the job and the money and just get the hell out of those woods. But I couldn't. I needed this paycheck, and besides, I told myself, one strange night didn't mean anything. It was probably just some animal I wasn't familiar with, nothing more. So, pushing down my unease, I grabbed my camera and headed out for another day of work. Little did I know, this decision would lead me down a path of terror I could never have imagined. The true horrors of the Checamigon National Forest were just beginning to reveal themselves, and I was about to be caught right in the middle of it all. The day passed uneventfully, almost mockingly so. The forest was alive with the usual sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the wind rustling through the autumn leaves. I managed to get some good shots of a few more rare species, including a beautiful Henslow's sparrow, but even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some nameless threat. By the time the sun began to set, my nerves were frayed. I hurried back to the cabin, my camera bag bouncing against my hip as I half-jogged through the darkening woods. Once inside, I bolted the door and lit the kerosene lantern. Its warm glow did little to dispel the growing shadows or my mounting anxiety. I tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's photographs, but my mind kept wandering back to those strange tracks and the sounds from the night before. As darkness fell, the forest outside grew unnaturally quiet. No owls hooting, no nocturnal creatures stirring, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on the cabin from all sides. I sat at the small table, my dinner of canned beans untouched, straining my ears for any sound. It started around midnight, a low guttural noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a howl, not really. It was deeper, more primal. Something ancient and wrong. The sound circled the cabin just outside the perimeter of the clearing, never getting closer but never moving away. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was no ordinary predator. Whatever was out there, it was toying with me, staying just out of sight, waiting for I didn't know what. Then the howling started. It echoed through the trees, a sound so alien and terrifying that it froze me in place. It wasn't the call of any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was something else, something worse. With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and the rifle I had brought for emergencies. I'd never been much for guns, but right then I was grateful for its solid weight in my hands. I inched toward the window, peering out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing but shadows cast by the moonlight filtering through the trees. But I could feel it. It was out there, watching, waiting for me to make a move. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Dead silence fell over the forest like a heavy blanket, and then came the thud. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, as if something massive had landed on the roof of the cabin. My blood ran cold as I backed away from the window, clutching the rifle like it was my lifeline. I could hear it moving above me, slow and purposeful. Each step caused the tin roof to groan under its weight. Then there was a sharp screech, the sound of claws scraping against metal. Whatever it was trying to find a way in. In that moment, fueled by terror and a desperate need to defend myself, I did something incredibly stupid. I swung open the front door, aiming the rifle into the dark night. For a split second, I saw it. Crouched low on the edge of the roof, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even in its hunched position. Its body was covered in wiry black fur, matted in places with what looked horribly like dried blood. But it was the creature's form that truly chilled me to my core. It was like a sick blend of a wolf and something larger, almost bear-like, but its limbs were too long, too thin. They bent at unnatural angles, ending in massive paws tipped with curved claws that looked capable of tearing through steel. Its face, God, its face. The elongated snout filled with razor-sharp teeth, but the eyes, they were almost human, intelligent, hungry. It was no animal I could recognize, no creature that should exist in this or any world. Our eyes met for what felt like an eternity, but could only have been a fraction of a second. Then it roared, a sound so loud and unnatural it felt like the ground itself shook beneath my feet. Operating on pure instinct, I fired. The shot rang out, deafeningly loud in the quiet forest. I saw the creature jerk as the bullet hit its shoulder, and it let out a deafening screech of pain and rage before leaping off the roof and disappearing into the trees with impossible speed. For a moment I stood frozen in the doorway, rifle still raised, ears ringing from the gunshot. The thing had run off, but I had no idea if it would come back. With trembling hands I slammed the door shut and locked it, then wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. The rest of the night I sat in the corner of the cabin, gun in hand, jumping at every creak and groan of the old structure. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It defied all logic, all understanding of the natural world. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside, heart still racing. I found a trail of dark, almost black blood leading from the cabin's porch deep into the forest. I wasn't about to follow it. Instead, I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking so badly I could barely close my camera bag. As I hurried through the woods towards my car, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle in the underbrush made me spin around, rifle at the ready. But nothing came for me. I reached the car without incident and peeled out of there as fast as the old rental would go, spewing gravel behind me. As the miles between me and that godforsaken forest grew, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was some twisted evolutionary mistake, some horrific mutation. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this world. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? A stressed-out, sleep-deprived photographer claiming to have seen some impossible monster in the woods? I'd be laughed out of every police station and ranger office in the state. Instead, I drove straight back to Philadelphia, abandoning the job and any hope of payment. I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far away from those woods as possible. In the years that followed, I often found myself lying awake at night, replaying those terrifying moments in my mind. The sound of those footsteps circling the cabin, the inhuman howl echoing through the trees, the sight of that thing crouched on the roof, its 2 human eyes locked on mine. I never set foot in Wisconsin again. Hell, I barely left the city after that. I gave up wildlife photography altogether, finding work as a studio photographer instead. The pay was worse, the work less satisfying, but at least I was safe. At least there were always people around. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear that howl again. And I wonder, with a chill running down my spine, if that thing is still out there in the Chequamegon National Forest, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. Whatever it was, evolutionary mistake, cryptid, or something far worse, I hope to God I never encounter it again. And I pray that no one else ever has to experience the terror I faced in those dark Wisconsin woods. The drive back to Philadelphia was a blur. I barely remember stopping for gas or food, my mind replaying the horrifying encounter over and over again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, its unnaturally human eyes boring into mine. The memory of its roar echoed in my ears, drowning out the hum of the car's engine and the rush of passing traffic. By the time I reached the outskirts of Philadelphia, exhaustion had set in. I'd been driving for nearly 15 hours straight, fueled by nothing but gas station coffee and raw fear. My hands shook as I navigated the familiar streets, relief washing over me as I finally pulled up in front of my rundown apartment building. The security of the city, the street lights, the distant sound of sirens, the occasional groups of people walking by should have been comforting. Instead, I found myself jumping at every shadow, half expecting to see that monstrous form lurking in every dark alley. I stumbled up to my apartment, fumbling with the keys. Once inside, I locked the door, then checked it again and again. I drew the curtains tight, then sat on my threadbare couch, the rifle I'd brought back from Wisconsin cradled in my lap. Sleep was out of the question. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I'd abandoned a job, one that I desperately needed. Rent was due in a week, and I had maybe $50 to my name. But even as panic over my financial situation tried to take hold, it was dwarfed by the memory of what I'd encountered in those woods. The next few days passed in a haze. I barely left my apartment, ordering cheap takeout and subsisting on coffee and fear. I jumped at every noise, a neighbor's door slamming, a car backfiring on the street below. Sleep, when it came, was filled with nightmares of glowing eyes and impossibly long claws reaching for me in the dark. I knew I needed to pull myself together. The rent wasn't going to pay itself, and I had bills piling up. But every time I thought about picking up my camera, about heading out for a new assignment, panic clawed at my throat. How could I go back into the wilderness after what I'd seen? A week after my return, I forced myself to call the wildlife conservation group that had hired me for the Wisconsin job. I mumbled some excuse about falling ill, apologized profusely, and promised to send them what photos I had managed to take before my sickness forced me to leave. They were understandably disappointed, but thankfully didn't press for details. The meager payment for the incomplete job barely covered my rent, leaving me scraping by on ramen noodles and tap water. But I didn't care. I was safe in the city, surrounded by concrete and steel and millions of people. No forests, no isolated cabins, no monsters. As the weeks passed, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen in Wisconsin was just a hallucination, a product of stress and isolation. But every time I closed my eyes, every time I heard an unexpected noise, the memory came rushing back with vivid clarity. The matted fur, the twisted limbs, those eyes. God, those eyes. I started drinking heavily, trying to numb the fear and quiet the constant replay of that night in my mind. It didn't help. If anything, the alcohol only made the nightmares worse, more vivid. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around me like grasping claws. My work suffered. The few assignments I managed to take on were uninspired, my once steady hands now shaky, my eye for composition dulled by constant anxiety. Clients began to look elsewhere, and my already precarious financial situation worsened. 3 months after the incident, I hit rock bottom. I was behind on rent, my electricity had been shut off, and I was surviving on handouts from a local soup kitchen. That's when I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I sold most of my camera equipment, keeping only my trusty Nikon F4 and a couple of lenses. With the money, I bought a bus ticket to New York City. If Philadelphia wasn't enough of an urban jungle to make me feel safe, maybe the concrete canyons of Manhattan would do the trick. New York was a shock to the system. The constant noise, the endless crowds, the towering skyscrapers. It was about as far from the Wisconsin woods as I could get. I found a tiny, roach-infested studio apartment in a rundown part of Brooklyn and took whatever photography jobs I could find. Weddings, school portraits, even the occasional seedy glamour shoot. Anything to keep a roof over my head and food in my stomach. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my life. The panic attacks became less frequent, the nightmares less vivid. I still couldn't bring myself to take nature assignments, but I found a niche in urban photography. The harsh lines of the city, the interplay of light and shadow among the buildings. It was a far cry from the serene wilderness shots that had once been my passion, but it paid the bills. Years passed. I built a modest reputation as a competent, if unremarkable, commercial photographer. I even managed to save enough to move to a slightly better apartment, one where the roaches were fewer and the neighbors slightly less noisy. But I never forgot. How could I? The memory of that night in Wisconsin was etched into my very soul. I became something of an amateur cryptozoologist, spending my free time researching bizarre creature sightings and unexplained phenomena. I never found anything that quite matched what I had seen, but there were enough similar accounts to keep me up at night, wondering. It was during one of these late-night research sessions, nearly a decade after my encounter, that I came across a news article that made my blood run cold. A series of mysterious animal attacks in northern Wisconsin, not far from where I had stayed all those years ago. The article described mangled bodies, strange tracks, and an eerie howling that had the local residents terrified. As I read the details, my hands began to shake. It was happening again. That thing or others like it was still out there, still hunting, still killing. I stared at my computer screen for a long time, my mind racing. I thought about all the people who might fall victim to that creature if nothing was done. I thought about the nightmares that had plagued me for years, the fear that had nearly destroyed my life. And I made a decision. The next morning I bought a plane ticket to Wisconsin. I dug out my old Nikon F4 and the rifle I had kept hidden in the back of my closet for all these years. As I packed, I tried to convince myself that I was being brave, that I was doing the right thing. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't going back to Wisconsin to be a hero. I was going back because I needed to know. I needed to face that thing again, to prove to myself that it was real, that I wasn't crazy, and maybe, just maybe, to find a way to stop it. As I boarded the plane, my heart pounding in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. Whatever awaited me in those dark Wisconsin woods, I was going to face it head on. Little did I know the horrors I had experienced a decade ago were just the beginning. What I would discover on this return trip would shake my understanding of reality to its very core and plunge me into a nightmare far beyond anything I could have imagined. The flight to Wisconsin was tense, to say the least. Every bump of turbulence had me gripping the armrests, my mind conjuring images of clawed hands reaching up from the earth to drag the plane down. By the time we landed in Milwaukee, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my nerves were frayed to breaking point. I rented a car at the airport, a sturdy SUV this time. No more rickety old sedans for me. As I drove north, away from the city and into the gradually thickening forests, I couldn't help but question my sanity. What the hell was I doing, going back to the scene of the most terrifying experience of my life, chasing after a monster that had nearly killed me once before? But I knew I had no choice. The nightmares, the constant fear, the way my life had been derailed, I needed closure. And if there was even a chance that I could prevent others from experiencing the terror I had lived with for the past decade, I had to try. I arrived in the small town of Hayward as the sun was setting. It was the closest sizable settlement to the area where the attacks had been reported. As I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet everything seemed. The streets were nearly deserted, and the few people I did see hurried along with their heads down, casting nervous glances at the darkening sky. That night I lay awake in my motel room, listening to the wind howling outside. It sounded too much like that creature's call for comfort. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start, my heart racing, sure that I had heard scratching at the window. But when I looked, there was nothing there. The next morning I headed to the local diner for breakfast and to see what information I could gather. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of locals nursing cups of coffee at the counter. As I slid into a booth, I couldn't help but overhear their hushed conversation. Another one last night, one of them was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. Jim Hawkins' boy. Found him this morning out by Miller's Creek, or what was left of him anyway. The other man crossed himself, his face pale. Jesus, that's the third one this month. What the hell is going on in these woods? I cleared my throat, causing both men to turn and look at me with suspicious eyes. Excuse me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I couldn't help but overhear. I'm a wildlife photographer from out of town. What exactly is happening here? The two men exchanged glances, seeming to have a silent conversation about whether to trust me. Finally, the older of the two spoke up. You picked a bad time to come taking pictures, mister. There's something out there in the woods, something not natural. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, not natural? The younger man leaned in, his voice dropping even lower. It started about a month ago. Livestock going missing, pets disappearing. Then we started finding bodies, torn apart like nothing we've ever seen. No animal we know of could do that kind of damage. And the sounds, the older man added, his eyes distant, the howling at night. It ain't no wolf, I can tell you that. It's something else, something worse. I nodded, trying to keep my hands from shaking as I sipped my coffee. Has anyone seen this thing? They both shook their heads. Not clearly, the younger man said. Just glimpses, big, they say, fast, and those eyes. He trailed off, shuddering. I thanked them for the information and quickly finished my breakfast. As I left the diner, my mind was racing. It all sounded too familiar. The attacks, the descriptions. It had to be the same creature I had encountered all those years ago. Or maybe, terrifyingly, there was more than one of them. I spent the day gathering supplies, extra batteries for my camera, first aid kit, heavy-duty flashlights. I also picked up a detailed map of the area and marked the locations of the reported attacks. They seemed to be centered around a remote area of the Mega National Forest, not far from where I had stayed during my ill-fated assignment a decade earlier. As I prepared to head into the woods the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. But I was in too deep now. I had to see this through, for my own sake and for the safety of others. Little did I know, I was about to uncover a truth far more terrifying than anything I had imagined. The creature I had encountered years ago was just the tip of the iceberg. What lurked in the depths of those Wisconsin woods was something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and about the limits of human terror. I set out at dawn, the early morning mist still clinging to the trees as I drove deeper into the Mega National Forest. The SUV handled the rough forest roads better than my old rental car had all those years ago, but every bump and jostle had me on edge, half expecting to see a monstrous form leap out from behind the trees at any moment. I parked at an old logging trail, as close as I could get to the area where the attacks had been concentrated. As I stepped out of the car, the silence of the forest pressed in around me. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath, waiting. With my camera around my neck and the rifle slung over my shoulder, I set off down the overgrown trail. Every step felt like I was moving deeper into another world, one where the rules of nature as I knew them no longer applied. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, ready to snatch me up at any moment. After about an hour of hiking, I came across the first sign that I was on the right track, or the wrong one, depending on how you looked at it. There, in a small clearing, was a scene of carnage that turned my stomach. The remains of what I guessed was once a deer lay scattered across the forest floor. But this was no ordinary predator kill. The carcass had been torn apart with a savagery that defied explanation, bones splintered and flesh shredded beyond recognition. I forced myself to approach, my camera raised to document the scene. As I took photos, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with the deer's blood and viscera were tufts of coarse black fur that matched exactly what I remembered from the creature I had encountered years ago. As I knelt to examine the fur more closely, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, rifle raised, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing there, just shadows and trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. I pressed on, deeper into the forest. The terrain became rougher, the trees older and more gnarled. I came across more signs of the creature's presence, more mangled carcasses, deep claw marks gouged into tree trunks, and always those tufts of coarse black fur. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, I realized I had a decision to make. I could turn back now, make it to my car before full dark set in, or I could press on, possibly getting closer to the truth, but risking being caught in these woods after nightfall. The smart choice, the sane choice, would have been to turn back. But I didn't come all this way to play it safe. I pushed on, my flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening, taking on a life of their own, Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, had me spinning around, expecting to see glowing eyes and bared fangs. It was nearing midnight when I found it. I had just crested a small hill when the beam of my flashlight fell upon the entrance to a cave. But this was no ordinary cave. The entrance was massive, easily 20 feet high, and the rock around it was scarred with those same deep claw marks I had seen on the trees. As I stood there, staring into the yawning blackness of the cave mouth, a sound echoed from deep within. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I knew I couldn't. Whatever answers I was looking for, whatever truth lay behind the horrors I had witnessed, it was in that cave. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the rifle, and stepped into the darkness. The cave was a nightmare made real. The beam of my flashlight revealed walls slick with some unidentifiable substance, the floor littered with bones, some animal, some terrifyingly human. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something musky and alien. I moved deeper into the cave, my footsteps echoing off the damp walls. The main tunnel branched off into smaller passages, a labyrinth of darkness that seemed to go on forever. And everywhere those claw marks gouged deep into the rock. I don't know how long I wandered through that underground hell. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the oppressive darkness, but eventually I emerged into a large chamber, and what I saw there stopped me dead in my tracks. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. But it wasn't the size that held me transfixed, it was what filled it. Dozens, maybe hundreds of cocoon-like structures hung from the walls and ceiling. They pulsed with an inner light, casting a sickly glow over the chamber. And inside each one, I could see movement, writhing, twisted shapes that were neither fully human nor fully animal. As I stood there, trying to comprehend what I was seeing, a sound behind me made me spin around. There, blocking the entrance to the chamber, was the creature I had come all this way to find. But it wasn't alone. 5 of them stood there, each as horrifying as I remembered. Massive, hunched forms covered in matted black fur, long limbs ending in razor-sharp claws, faces that were a nightmarish blend of wolf and something almost human. But it was their eyes that held me paralyzed with terror. Glowing with an otherworldly intelligence, they fixed on me with a hunger that was all too familiar. I raised my rifle, knowing even as I did so that it was useless against these monsters. The largest of the creatures, the one I recognized from my encounter years ago, stepped forward. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth, and it spoke. The sound that came out was like nothing I had ever heard before, a guttural, clicking language that hurt my ears and sent shivers down my spine. But somehow, impossibly, I understood what it was saying. "Welcome, photographer," it growled, its voice like gravel being crushed. "We've been waiting for you to return." As the other creatures moved to surround me, I felt my grip on reality slipping. This couldn't be happening. These things couldn't exist, and they certainly couldn't speak. What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The lead creature's mouth twisted into what I could only describe as a gruesome approximation of a smile. "We are the Old Ones," it growled. "We have walked this earth long before your kind crawled out of the muck, and now we rise again." My mind reeled, trying to process what I was hearing. These creatures, these Old Ones, were something out of prehistoric nightmares. But how? Why now? As if reading my thoughts, the creature continued. "Your kind has pushed too far, invaded too much of our world. The balance is upset. We awaken to restore it." I glanced around at the pulsing cocoons that filled the chamber. "And those?" I asked, dreading the answer. "The next generation," the creature snarled. "Born of your kind and ours. They will inherit this world." Horror washed over me as I realized the full implications of what I was seeing. These monsters weren't just killing people. They were transforming them, creating some kind of hybrid abominations. In that moment, I knew I couldn't let this continue. Whatever the cost, this had to end here. With a speed born of desperation, I raised my rifle and fired at the nearest cocoon. The blast echoed through the chamber, and the cocoon burst open, spilling its half-formed contents onto the cave floor. The creatures roared in fury, the sound shaking the very walls of the cave. I dove to the side as they lunged for me, narrowly avoiding their slashing claws. I rolled to my feet and sprinted deeper into the chamber, firing wildly at the cocoons as I ran. Chaos erupted. The creatures were everywhere, their howls of rage mixing with the sickening sounds of bursting cocoons and the screeches of the monstrosities within. I kept moving, kept firing, driven by a single thought: destroy them all. I don't know how long the battle raged. Time lost all meaning in that underground hell. I was operating on pure adrenaline, dodging, firing, reloading. My world narrowed to a series of snapshots, gleaming claws slashing inches from my face, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the stench of the creature's blood, the sickening squelch of another cocoon bursting. I was vaguely aware that I was being herded, driven back towards the entrance of the chamber. But I was beyond caring. If I was going to die here, I was going to take as many of these abominations with me as I could. As I burst out of the main chamber and into the tunnel beyond, I fumbled in my pocket for the flare I had brought. In one fluid motion, I struck it and tossed it back into the chamber. The red light illuminated a scene straight out of a nightmare: writhing bodies, both monstrous and half-formed, and the enraged faces of the old ones. I didn't wait to see more. I ran, my legs pumping, my lungs burning as I sprinted through the twisting tunnels. Behind me I could hear the creatures in pursuit, their howls echoing off the cave walls. I burst out of the cave entrance, the cool night air hitting me like a physical force. Without breaking stride, I sprinted for the trees, zigging and zagging to avoid the slashing claws I knew were right behind me. As I ran, I became aware of a growing rumble. At first I thought it was just the blood pounding in my ears, but it grew louder, drowning out even the howls of the pursuing creatures. I risked a glance back and saw something that defied belief. The entire hillside where the cave entrance had been was collapsing in on itself. Whether from the gunfire, the flare, or some other cause, the cave system was caving in. The old one's howls took on a new note. Not rage now, but fear. They turned back, trying to reach their lair, their progeny, but it was too late. With a deafening roar, the hillside collapsed completely, burying the cave entrance under tons of rock and earth. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hand shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away, my rearview mirror showed only darkness behind me. No pursuing monsters, no unearthly glow, just the normal natural darkness of the forest at night. The drive back to town was a blur. I vaguely remember bursting into the sheriff's office, babbling about monsters and caves and cocoons. They must have thought I was mad or drunk or both. But something in my eyes, or maybe the state of my torn and bloodied clothes, convinced them to at least send a team to investigate. I didn't stick around to see what they found. As soon as I gave them the location, I got in my car and drove. I didn't stop until I was back in New York, the familiar noise and bustle of the city a soothing balm to my shattered nerves. In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured the news for any mention of what had happened in those Wisconsin woods. There were reports of a geological event that had caused a minor landslide. A few articles mentioned the mysterious animal attacks coming to an abrupt end. But of the creatures, the cave, the cocoons, nothing. Sometimes in my darkest moments I wonder if it all really happened. If maybe the stress and the isolation and the years of fear hadn't finally caused me to snap, to imagine the whole terrifying encounter. But then I look at the scars on my arms, claw marks that no doctor has been able to explain. I remember the feel of my rifle kicking in my hands, the sound of those unearthly howls, and I know it was real. All of it. I don't take nature photographs anymore. I don't go camping or hiking. I stay in the city, surrounded by concrete and steel and millions of people. But sometimes when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear a distant howl. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, I didn't get them all. Because if there's one thing I learned in those dark Wisconsin woods, it's that the world is a much older, much stranger place than we ever imagined. And sometimes the monsters of our nightmares are all too real. My name is Donald White, and at 80 years old I've seen my fair share of life's twists and turns. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that fateful hiking trip in the Appalachians. Even now, years later, my hands tremble as I recount the horrors we faced in those remote woods. I've always been an outdoorsman. Growing up in rural Virginia, I spent my childhood exploring the forests and streams near our family farm. As I grew older, my love for nature only intensified. I served in the Army for a spell, and those years only honed my survival skills and appreciation for the wilderness. After retiring from my job as a high school history teacher, I threw myself into hiking with renewed vigor. It kept me fit, sharp, and connected to the natural world in a way that nothing else could. My wife, God rest her soul, used to joke that I loved the mountains more than her. She wasn't far off, truth be told. After she passed 5 years ago, those hills became my solace, my escape from the loneliness that threatened to consume me. That's where Callum came in. I met him at a local hiking club meeting, a sprightly 65-year-old with a shock of white hair and a mischievous glint in his eye. We hit it off immediately, swapping tales of our adventures and misadventures on the trails. Before long, we were planning weekly hikes together, pushing each other to tackle more challenging routes despite our advancing years. It was Callum who suggested this particular trip. "Donald," he said one day as we were catching our breath at the summit of a local peak, "I found this spot up near the Kentucky border. It's off the beaten path, real secluded, supposed to be beautiful this time of year. What do you say we make a weekend of it?" I should have known better. At our age, sticking to well-traveled trails is just common sense. But Callum had a way of making you feel young again, invincible even. And I'll admit, the prospect of exploring uncharted territory excited me. It had been years since I'd done any serious backcountry hiking. "Why not?" I replied, grinning like a schoolboy. "Let's do it." We spent the next few weeks planning our trip meticulously. I dusted off my old topographical maps of the region, while Callum scoured online forums for any information about the area. We checked and double-checked our gear, making sure we had everything we might need for a few days in the wilderness. The morning of our departure, I woke before dawn, a mix of excitement and apprehension churning in my gut. I made a thermos of strong coffee and triple-checked my backpack. As I waited for Callum to pick me up in his old Jeep, I found myself staring at a photo of my late wife on the mantel. "Wish me luck, Martha," I murmured. "I've got a feeling I'm going to need it." The drive from Roanoke took us about 4 hours. As we left the highways behind and wound our way into the mountains, I felt the familiar sense of peace that always comes over me in wild places. The trees pressed close to the road, their leaves just beginning to hint at the autumn colors to come. The air grew cooler and fresher as we climbed higher into the hills. Callum and I chatted easily, as we always did. He told me about his granddaughter's recent piano recital, and I shared some stories from my teaching days. But as we neared our destination, a strange silence fell over us. The road had narrowed to little more than a dirt track, and the forest seemed to close in around us, blocking out much of the morning light. "You sure about this place, Cal?" I asked, peering out the window at the dense undergrowth. Callum's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "It'll be fine, Don. Just a little overgrown is all. Probably why it's not so popular with the tourists." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading somewhere we shouldn't be. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. For a moment I could have sworn I saw movement in the shadows between the trunks, but when I blinked, there was nothing there. Finally, we reached a small clearing that served as a makeshift trailhead. There was barely enough room to park the Jeep. As we got out and shouldered our packs, I noticed something odd. The air was completely still and eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence that seemed to press down on us. "Cal," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet, "you ever been here before?" He shook his head, his earlier bravado seeming to fade a bit. "Nah, first time. But that's the point, right? Exploring new places?" I forced a smile and nodded, but deep down, something felt very wrong. As we set off down the overgrown trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapping twig, every shadow seemed to hide some unseen threat. Little did I know those vague fears were about to become all too real. The horrors that awaited us in those remote hills would test not only our survival skills, but the very limits of our sanity. And as we took our first steps into the wilderness, I had no idea that this trip would become the most harrowing experience of my long life. As Callum and I ventured deeper into the forest, the oppressive silence gradually gave way to the usual sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, the distant gurgle of a stream. It was as if the forest had been holding its breath, waiting to see if we would dare to enter its domain. The familiarity of these sounds eased my tension somewhat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We hiked for several hours, the trail becoming increasingly difficult to follow. What had started as a narrow but clear path soon devolved into little more than a game trail, forcing us to consult our map and compass frequently. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. "We should have hit that vista point by now," Callum muttered, wiping sweat from his brow as he studied the map. "Maybe we took a wrong turn back at that fallen oak?" I nodded, trying to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. "Could be. Want to backtrack a bit?" Callum shook his head. "Nah, let's press on. We're bound to hit something recognizable soon." As the day wore on, our optimism began to wane. The landmarks on our map seemed to bear little resemblance to our surroundings, and the forest appeared to grow more primeval with each step. Ancient trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted, loomed over us. Thick moss covered everything, muffling our footsteps and adding to the eerie atmosphere. It was late afternoon when we stumbled upon the first sign that we weren't alone in these woods. As we paused to catch our breath and check our bearings, I noticed something strange about a nearby tree. There were markings on its trunk, crude symbols carved deep into the bark. "Cal, take a look at this," I called, running my fingers over the rough engravings. They didn't resemble any trail markers I'd ever seen. Instead, they looked almost like pictographs, primitive drawings of stick figures and unidentifiable shapes. Callum frowned as he examined the markings. "Weird. Maybe some kind of local folklore thing or kids messing around." I shook my head. "These carvings are old, Cal. Look how the bark has grown around them." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Someone, or something, had been in these woods long before us, and they might still be here. As if on cue, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind us. We both whirled around, hearts pounding. The dense undergrowth revealed nothing, but I could have sworn I saw a shadow move between the trees. "We should keep moving," Callum said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, and we set off again, our pace quickening. The sun was setting by the time we reached the dilapidated cabin, casting long shadows through the trees and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. But as we approached the ramshackle structure, I felt only dread. The cabin was a single-room affair, its log walls sagging and its roof partially collapsed. Vines crept up its sides, nature slowly reclaiming what man had built. It looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades, yet there was something unsettling about it, as if it were watching us, waiting. "We should check it out," Callum suggested, already moving towards the door. "Maybe we can find something to help us get our bearings." I wanted to object, to suggest we keep moving and try to find our way back to civilization, but the encroaching darkness and the promise of shelter, however dilapidated, won out. With great reluctance, I followed Callum into the cabin. The interior was a study in decay. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the smell of mold and rot was overwhelming. What little furniture remained was in various stages of collapse, but it was the walls that caught our attention. They were covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen carved into the tree, along with crude drawings that made my blood run cold. Stick figures engaged in what looked like hunting scenes, but the prey didn't resemble any animals I recognized. There were spiral patterns, stars, and other geometric shapes interspersed among the figures, and everywhere a recurring symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it, like a stylized eye. "What is all this?" Callum muttered, running his flashlight beam over the walls. Before I could respond, a sound from outside froze us in our tracks. It was a low, guttural noise, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal, but somewhere horrifyingly in between. We exchanged glances, our faces pale in the dim light of our flashlights. The sound came again, closer this time. Something was out there, and it was moving towards the cabin. "We need to leave," I whispered urgently. "Now!" But as we turned to go, the floorboards creaked behind us. Slowly, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest, I turned around. A figure stood in the shadows of the far corner, so still it might have been a statue. But as our flashlight beams fell upon it, it moved. It was human in shape, but there was something profoundly wrong about its proportions. Its arms were too long, its fingers ending in what looked like claws. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and covered in those same strange markings we'd seen on the walls. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Sunken eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like a cat's, a nose that was little more than 2 slits, and a mouth that split its face in a Glasgow smile, revealing rows of sharpened teeth. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We stood frozen, staring at the creature. Then it moved, faster than anything that size should be able to move. We bolted for the door, the creature's inhuman shriek piercing the air behind us. We ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping our faces and roots threatening to trip us at every step. The creature pursued, its cries echoing through the trees, joined by other similar sounds. There were more of them, and they were all around us. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish chase. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Callum was just ahead of me, his white hair visible in the gloom. Suddenly he cried out in pain. I saw him stumble, his foot caught in a tangle of roots. I reached for him, but something dark and fast moved between us. Callum's scream was cut short, and then he was gone, dragged into the underbrush by unseen hands. "Callum," I yelled, my voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. But there was no response, only the rustling of leaves and those terrible, inhuman sounds. I wanted to go after him, to try and save my friend. But the rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive for 80 years, knew it was hopeless. So I ran, tears streaming down my face, my friend's final cry echoing in my ears. I don't know how I found my way out of those woods. The next clear memory I have is stumbling onto a rural highway, collapsing to my knees as a pair of headlights illuminated me. The driver, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, took me to the nearest hospital. I told my story to the police, to park rangers, to anyone who would listen. Search parties were organized, but they found no trace of Callum or the creatures I described. The cabin, when they finally located it, showed no signs of the drawings or the struggle I remembered. I began to doubt my own sanity. Years have passed since that terrible night. I've been back to those woods, driven by guilt and a need for closure. I've never found any concrete evidence of what happened, but sometimes when the wind blows just right, I can hear those inhuman cries echoing through the trees. I don't hike anymore. The outdoors, once my greatest passion, now fills me with dread. I've tried to move on, to forget, but the memories of that night haunt me still, and sometimes in my darkest moments I wonder, what if they're still out there, waiting in the shadows of the forest? What if someday they decide to venture beyond their domain? So I share my story as a warning. The wilderness holds secrets darker than we can imagine, and sometimes it's better to stick to the well-traveled paths, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the deep, dark woods. The years following my harrowing experience in the Appalachian wilderness were a blur of sleepless nights, therapy sessions, and fruitless searches for answers. The authorities had long since closed the case on Callum's disappearance, chalking it up to a tragic hiking accident. But I knew the truth, even if I sometimes doubted my own sanity. 5 years after that fateful trip, I received a letter that would once again turn my world upside down. It was from a man named Dr. Elias Thornton, an anthropologist specializing in folklore and indigenous cultures of the Appalachian region. He had heard about my story through a colleague and was interested in meeting with me. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a small cafe in Roanoke. Dr. Thornton was younger than I expected, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened intently as I recounted my experience once again, not interrupting or showing any signs of disbelief. When I finished, he pulled out a worn leather notebook from his bag. "Mr. White," he said, his voice low and serious, "I believe you, and I think I might know what you encountered in those woods." He proceeded to tell me about his research into the folklore of the region. He spoke of legends predating European settlement, tales of creatures that lived deep in the mountains, neither human nor animal. The indigenous peoples called them the Old Ones and left offerings to keep them appeased. But here's where it gets interesting, Dr. Thornton continued, flipping through his notebook. There are similar stories from early settlers. They called these creatures the hill folk or the forest people. Most dismissed them as superstition, but there were occasional reports of encounters eerily similar to what you described. He showed me sketches and photographs of cave paintings and artifacts, all featuring symbols like those I had seen in the cabin. The circular eye symbol appeared repeatedly. These stories mostly died out by the early 20th century, he explained. But every few decades, there's a cluster of disappearances or strange sightings in the area where you and your friend were hiking. The most recent was about 30 years ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why hasn't anyone investigated this further? Dr. Thornton sighed. Lack of concrete evidence, mostly. And frankly, most people don't want to believe. It's easier to blame animal attacks or accidental deaths. But I've been piecing together the pattern for years, and your account is the most detailed I've ever heard. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. Mr. White, I'm planning an expedition into that area next month. I want to document everything I can, gather evidence, and I was hoping you might consider joining us as a guide. My immediate instinct was to refuse. The very thought of returning to those woods filled me with dread. But as Dr. Thornton continued to talk, outlining his plans and safety precautions, a part of me began to see it as an opportunity, a chance for closure, perhaps, or redemption for leaving Callum behind. Against all logic, I found myself agreeing to join the expedition. The next few weeks were a flurry of preparation. Our team consisted of Dr. Thornton, 2 of his graduate students, a local guide named Ray who knew the area well, and myself. We had state-of-the-art camping gear, satellite phones, and GPS trackers. Dr. Thornton had even managed to get permits for camera traps and environmental sampling. As we set out on a crisp autumn morning, I felt a mix of terror and determination. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but I knew appearances could be deceiving. For the first few days, our expedition was uneventful. We documented local flora and fauna, set up camera traps, and collected soil and water samples. Dr. Thornton was particularly interested in some of the older trees, believing they might hold clues in their growth patterns. It was on the 4th night that things took a turn. We had set up camp in a small clearing not far from where Callum and I had found the cabin years ago. As darkness fell, an unnatural silence descended on the forest. No insects chirping, no nocturnal animals stirring. Ray, who had been skeptical of my story, was the first to notice something was off. "Y'all hear that?" he whispered, his face pale in the firelight. We all strained our ears. At first I heard nothing. Then faintly I caught it, that same low guttural sound that had haunted my nightmares for years. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now!" But it was too late. Dark shapes moved at the edge of our camp, just beyond the reach of our firelight. One of the graduate students screamed as a pale, elongated arm reached out from the darkness, dragging her into the woods. What followed was chaos. We ran, abandoning our equipment, our research, everything. I could hear the creatures pursuing us, their inhuman cries echoing through the trees. Ray fell behind, and I heard his scream cut short. Dr. Thornton and I, along with his remaining student, managed to reach the jeep we had left at the trailhead. As we sped down the mountain road, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of pale figures watching from the tree line, their eyes reflecting the taillights like animals caught in headlights. The authorities were skeptical of our story, just as they had been of mine years ago. The 2 missing members of our team were never found. Dr. Thornton's reputation was ruined, his academic career over. The student dropped out of the program last I heard. As for me, I've made my peace with the fact that I'll never fully understand what happened in those woods. The creatures we encountered defy scientific explanation, straddling the line between reality and nightmare. I've since moved away from the mountains, settling in a small coastal town where the horizon is wide open and the forests are far away. But I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the echo of those inhuman cries ringing in my ears. To those who might read this and dismiss it as the ramblings of a traumatized old man, I say this: The world is older and stranger than we know. There are things in the dark corners of this earth that defy our understanding. And sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. But if you do venture into the wild places, stick to the well-traveled paths. And if you find yourself in a part of the forest where the birds fall silent and the shadows seem to move, run and don't look back. For there are some secrets the wilderness keeps that are best left undiscovered. The years following my harrowing experience in the Appalachian wilderness were a blur of sleepless nights, therapy sessions, and fruitless searches for answers. The authorities had long since closed the case on Callum's disappearance, chalking it up to a tragic hiking accident. But I knew the truth, even if I sometimes doubted my own sanity. 5 years after that fateful trip, I received a letter that would once again turn my world upside down. It was from a man named Dr. Elias Thornton, an anthropologist specializing in folklore and indigenous cultures of the Appalachian region. He had heard about my story through a colleague and was interested in meeting with me. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a small cafe in Roanoke. Dr. Thornton was younger than I expected, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened intently as I recounted my experience once again, not interrupting or showing any signs of disbelief. When I finished, he pulled out a worn leather notebook from his bag. "Mr. White," he said, his voice low and serious, "I believe you, and I think I might know what you encountered in those woods." He proceeded to tell me about his research into the folklore of the region. He spoke of legends predating European settlement, tales of creatures that lived deep in the mountains, neither human nor animal. The indigenous peoples called them the Old Ones, and left offerings to keep them appeased. "But here's where it gets interesting," Dr. Thornton continued, flipping through his notebook. "There are similar stories from early settlers. They called these creatures the hill folk or the forest people. Most dismissed them as superstition, but there were occasional reports of encounters eerily similar to what you described. He showed me sketches and photographs of cave paintings and artifacts, all featuring symbols like those I had seen in the cabin. The circular eye symbol appeared repeatedly. These stories mostly died out by the early 20th century, he explained. But every few decades there's a cluster of disappearances or strange sightings in the area where you and your friend were hiking. The most recent was about 30 years ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why hasn't anyone investigated this further? Dr. Thornton sighed. Lack of concrete evidence mostly, and frankly most people don't want to believe. It's easier to blame animal attacks or accidental deaths. But I've been piecing together the pattern for years, and your account is the most detailed I've ever heard. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Mr. White, I'm planning an expedition into that area next month. I want to document everything I can, gather evidence, and I was hoping you might consider joining us as a guide." My immediate instinct was to refuse. The very thought of returning to those woods filled me with dread. But as Dr. Thornton continued to talk, outlining his plans and safety precautions, a part of me began to see it as an opportunity, a chance for closure perhaps, or redemption for leaving Callum behind. Against all logic, I found myself agreeing to join the expedition. The next few weeks were a flurry of preparation. Our team consisted of Dr. Thornton, 2 of his graduate students, a local guide named Ray who knew the area well, and myself. We had state-of-the-art camping gear, satellite phones, and GPS trackers. Dr. Thornton had even managed to get permits for camera traps and environmental sampling. As we set out on a crisp autumn morning, I felt a mix of terror and determination. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but I knew appearances could be deceiving. For the first few days, our expedition was uneventful. We documented local flora and fauna, set up camera traps, and collected soil and water samples. Dr. Thornton was particularly interested in some of the older trees, believing they might hold clues in their growth patterns. It was on the 4th night that things took a turn. We had set up camp in a small clearing not far from where Callum and I had found the cabin years ago. As darkness fell, an unnatural silence descended on the forest. No insects chirping, no nocturnal animals stirring. Ray, who had been skeptical of my story, was the first to notice something was off. "Y'all hear that?" he whispered, his face pale in the firelight. We all strained our ears. At first I heard nothing. Then, faintly, I caught it, that same low, guttural sound that had haunted my nightmares for years. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." But it was too late. Dark shapes moved at the edge of our camp, just beyond the reach of our firelight. One of the graduate students screamed as a pale, elongated arm reached out from the darkness, dragging her into the woods. What followed was chaos. We ran, abandoning our equipment, our research, everything. I could hear the creatures pursuing us, their inhuman cries echoing through the trees. Ray fell behind, and I heard his scream cut short. Dr. Thornton and I, along with his remaining student, managed to reach the jeep we had left at the trailhead. As we sped down the mountain road, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of pale figures watching from the tree line, their eyes reflecting the taillights like animals caught in headlights. The authorities were skeptical of our story, just as they had been of mine years ago. The 2 missing members of our team were never found. Dr. Thornton's reputation was ruined, his academic career over. The student dropped out of the program last I heard. As for me, I've made my peace with the fact that I'll never fully understand what happened in those woods. The creatures we encountered defy scientific explanation, straddling the line between reality and nightmare. I've since moved away from the mountains, settling in a small coastal town where the horizon is wide open and the forests are far away. But I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the echo of those inhuman cries ringing in my ears. To those who might read this and dismiss it as the ramblings of a traumatized old man, I say this: the world is older and stranger than we know. There are things in the dark corners of this earth that defy our understanding, and sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. But if you do venture into the wild places, stick to the well-traveled paths, and if you find yourself in a part of the forest where the birds fall silent and the shadows seem to move, run, and don't look back. For there are some secrets the wilderness keeps that are best left undiscovered.